What's up YouTube? Today I will be reading another fanfic again, and as you can see from the title, it's In Another Life by LittleLuxray. If you haven't read it before and you want to try it out for yourself, then the link is down in the description so you can go read it. But before we start, grab some food, some drinks, a blanket, some tissues, maybe a bucket. Make yourself comfortable because this is going to be a very long ride. Some trigger warnings. There's a major character death involving a character of high Q, and there's talking about insomnia and, well, death, of course. So if you get uncomfortable with these kind of things, I recommend you click away. Remember, this is a fan fiction, so it isn't real, it isn't canon, and keep that in mind, please. Anyways, that's enough talk, let's get into it. It had been some time since Akashi set foot in that hospital. It was a dreary place for him, a place he was not fond of, but a place he was obligated to visit. Akashi's parents were intent on having him intern in a hospital nearby, so that he could stockpile more things that would look good on his resume for future purposes. Oftentimes, however, Akashi would disagree with his parents, unhappy with the suggestions they'd given him, but ultimately they would urge him to carry out the task that had been pushed on him, and one way or another he'd do it. Asking around here and there, the male put little to no effort in finding out where he could sign up for what. He didn't care, nor did he think he would care in the future. Akashi was unhappy with where he was, unhappy with what it was that he was doing. He was wasting time, asking for something that he did not want in the least. Pointing a finger down the hall, a small assistant nurse directed Akashi to a different desk, one where he would be able to find more information on the subject. Valiantly, he thanked her, and continued on his way, passing several rooms as he did so. His eyes were set forward. He didn't look in any of the rooms. He didn't want to. It would hurt if he did. Akashi closed his eyes and sighed, swaying absent-mindedly in his step, opening his eyes just in time to swiftly avoid colliding with someone. A doctor. No, just another person. He circled around the male, apologizing flatly before he continued on. It's alright, it could be heard from behind him, but it soon faded as Akashi continued forward. Do I really want this? His air stared forward, uninterested in the information desk several meters from him. No, I really don't. Standing still, Akashi remained in place for quite some time, his legs refusing to carry him further. People walked by him, around him, up and down the halls, to and front, but no one seemed to notice him. He stood there, hesitant, uninterested, indifferent, unfeeling. He remained in place silently. No one was bothered by him, so there he stood. He brought a hand up to push through his black hair, and slowly his head fell forward. Akashi stared at his shoes. What am I doing? The thought rattled in his mind. Why am I even here? Another person walked by at a gradual pace at first, then slowed down progressively as they drew near. Their walking slowed to a halt, and it was then that Akashi had become aware of the new individual who invaded his personal space. From his perspective, Akashi could see their hand reaching out for him. He withdrew and looked up. Oh, you can move. He smiled in Akashi's direction, bright yellow eyes catching his own. It had been the same guy he almost bumped into. Perhaps he remained in the hall and watched as Akashi had gone from a brisk walk to a sudden stop. He understood how that would be alarming to some people. Is there something wrong with me standing here? Akashi asked sincerely. No, I don't think so. He brought his hand down to his side. Why did you stop so suddenly? Are you alright? I'm fine. I was just thinking. Akashi blinked slowly. Of what? A question asked her. How thrilling. Of this hospital. I've realized that I don't want to come here anymore. The male who stood across from Akashi shifted his weight to one leg. Were you sick? Are you checking out? Akashi stared through the stranger. No, I'm not sick, but this place makes me feel like I am. His answer was cold, but it did not seem to cut through the other's pleasant mood. I feel the same about this place, honestly, he paused. So you must be leaving soon, then? Yeah, Akashi shifted, leaning in the direction of where he came from. He had no interest in staying where he was. His only intention was leaving. He figured he would tell his parents that other people in the hospital were too occupied with everything else to tend to him. He started on his way without so much as a second glance in the other's direction. Goodbye. Hey, hey! Akashi turned his head. What? What's your name? Why did he want to know his name? When would he ever use it again? The stranger could have been a patient at the hospital for all Akashi knew, and the last thing he needed was a sickly acquaintance to add to his already short list of friends. You don't need to know. The male across from him did well in hiding the look of offense that almost surfaced on his face. I understand, but what's for worth, my name's Bokuto. Akashi cast a wary look in Bokuto's direction, gave a nod, and continued on his way until he was out of the building. 2 weeks has passed since Akashi last visited, and to his dismay, he found himself on the same aimless path back to the same dreadless hospital. He couldn't stand his parents' persistent natures, but he was somewhat relieved to be out of the house, to say the least. Here we go again. Akashi entered the building and greeted the woman at the front desk, as always. He wasted no time ascending the steps needed to get to the part of the hospital where he'd almost reached all the time ago. In minutes, the information desk was in his sight, and for the first time in forever, he'd actually gone to it. He spoke with a small woman there, and after several minutes had passed, Akashi backed away from the desk, some sheets of paper in hand. He started down the hall, sighing heavily, intent on rushing home. Hey, it's you! The familiar voice made Akashi's throat tighten. Another sigh was forced out, even heavier this time. He turned around. Bokuto, apathy-kun. He grinned from ear to ear. Don't call me that. Akashi stuffed the sheets into his bag. I thought you said you weren't ever going to set foot in here again. There was something strange about the excitement in his tone. I didn't exactly say that, but it was implied. Akashi squinted. Yes, it was implied. Bokuto's smile never left his face, and his tired eyelids contradicted his facial expression. Why must I always run into strange ones? So, what brings you here again? I could ask you the same thing. Akashi's lips grouped to the side. Thick white eyebrows raised above yellow hues. I'm supposed to be here, actually. Akashi yawned. Intern? No, patient. His smile was unnerving. Silently, the dark-haired male frowned. I've been insensitive. A laugh bubbled out from Bokuto. No, you haven't. Don't worry about it. Though he'd been dressed in normal, casual clothing, upon further examination, there was indeed something sickly about him. He was paler than the others who walked along in the hills, and soft dark circles sat under his eyes. Akashi made sure not to stare. I know you aren't going to ask, so I'll just let you know. From what I've heard, the doctors say whatever I have is called FFI. Bokuto folded his arms. He held an air around him and as if he was having a normal conversation about the weather. Fatal familial insomnia, if I remember correctly. A cold shiver curled up Akashi's spine. He never heard of that disease before. It worried him enough to get some words out of him. I don't think I want to ask about the symptoms of this illness. Well, even if you wanted to, I wouldn't have an answer about you. Another laugh. All I can say is that sleeping doesn't come as easily as it used to. What normally would have pained someone to say, he delivered with ease, and with the same grin to boot. Akashi couldn't help but almost smile back, his lips barely twitching. He stared in Bokuto's direction, at him this time. Are you here every day? Of course, been here about 4 weeks now. He blinked sluggishly. I see. Akashi nodded once. No words were exchanged for a moment, and soon the short amount of silence had become awkward. Well, I'll be going now. Shut him out. Don't let him in. He's sick. 1 second. Akashi's jaw clenched. I have to go, Bokuto. He started on his way. Please don't persist. If you would please listen. His hands at his side, Bokuto bowed. Please, it will only take a second. Akashi was straightforward, but he wasn't heartless. He huffed out a breath and turned around. What is it? I really have to go. His eyes lighting up, Bokuto straightened his back and fished his hand into his pocket. He pulled out a phone, and to Akashi's dread, he asked for his phone number. What was he to do? What was he to say? Akashi literally found nothing special about Bokuto. Why had the sickly one taken a sudden liking to him? He wanted nothing more than to push him away, throw away the forms, and never set foot in that hospital again. But for some strange and irritating reason, Akashi found it difficult to deny Bokuto. He was trying to, he truly was, but just couldn't. I don't usually text, Akashi murmured. He looked down at Bokuto's phone. He couldn't look at his face. I'm often busy. Keeping in contact with me wouldn't be a good idea. He watched Bokuto's finger curl around the phone, and his hand slowly backed away. But Akashi shocked himself with that one word. He could still see Bokuto's hand, and it had frozen in place. I guess I could find some time to talk every so often. He looked up, and his gaze found Bokuto's. Those yellow eyes were gleaming. He entered his number swiftly and then handed the phone to Bokuto. The names section empty. Thank you. His voice was so full of excitement as he proceeded to answer the name for his new contact. Akashi walked closely as Bokuto mouthed and typed the name. A-P-A-T-H. Bokuto was close to saving the contact before Akashi spoke up. You don't have to put that, he sighed. It's Akashi. The sky burned a strong orange glow as the sun set in the distance. Akashi sat in bed, laptop in his lap, as his fingers scrolled and typed frantically. FFI. The page loaded. Akashi went straight into reading. FFI is a very rare autosomal dominant inherited prion disease of the brain. Akashi's eyes scanned the screen. FFI has no known cure and involves progressively worsening insomnia, which leads to hallucinations, delirium, and confusional states like that of dementia. Thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. His fingers remained stiff for quite some time as his eyes read the introductory paragraph over and over again. There's no known cure, huh? Akashi continued to read on. All the people who've contracted this disease eventually die within a year or less. This part was read out loud. He rubbed his face quietly. Of course they do. Akashi leaned his head on his hand, chin resting in his palm. I wonder if Bokuto knows about all of this. He must have looked it up at some point, right? It was the only normal thing to do, considering how he was the only one who was suffering from said disease. Insomnia. He thought back to the bags around Bokuto's eyes. All I can say is that sleeping doesn't come as easily as I used to. Akashi exhaled quickly through his nose, making a sound that was almost like a laugh. He read up the symptoms and blinked gently, a hand over his lips. After several minutes, Akashi closed his laptop and laid back on his bed. He stared at the ceiling. Some friend I've made. There wasn't much else to say. You have a new text message from Bokuto sent July 29th at 11:56 p.m. Hey, I hope this isn't a bad time. Akashi lifted his head from his pillow and reached a hand out to grab his phone. The bright light caused him to squint as he read the message. Quietly, he contemplated whether he wanted to respond or not. He blinked weakly and slid his fingers down the side of his phone, a sign of wariness that he could not disobey. Akashi watched as the screen went to black, and it was then that he placed the phone back on his nightstand, choosing to ignore the message. He couldn't sleep for about an hour after the text, but ultimately slipped off to sleep. Akashi never received another message in the remaining hour that he was awake. During the next day, Akashi decided to stay home. He sat in his room for the majority of the day and had spent at least 6 hours awake until he'd pick his phone up in his hands again. He looked at the message Bokuto had sent them the night before. His thumb aimlessly hovered over the keyboard, thinking of what to type. From Akashi, sent at 4:43 p.m. Hello, Bokuto. Hey! I must have texted you while you were asleep. Akashi was dumbfounded. He never received a faster response in his life. Akashi. Yeah, that must have been the case. You say hey a lot, Bokuto. Bokuto. I know, it's kind of my thing. Akashi could feel Bokuto's enthusiasm through his text messages. He spoke to Akashi as if he hadn't had a friend to text in years. Bokuto. How are you today? Akashi. I'm well, thank you. Just catching up on some volleyball things. Bokuto. Volleyball? You like volleyball too? We have to play together. Wincing a bit, Akashi squinted at his phone screen. Such an energetic texter, Bokuto was. He was kind of difficult to keep up with, and Akashi felt like this would be a long-term sort of thing. Akashi. Sure, I mean, will they let you out of the hospital? Bokuto. I guess. I can still walk around and get to where I have to go. Pretty much the only thing wrong with me is that I can't sleep. Akashi scowled. He could feel the ignorance emanating off of Bokuto's text messages. Did he really think he was admitted to a hospital just because he was having trouble sleeping? He knew full well the name of the disease he had, so why is he so cheerful about his entire situation? Why did he lack the understanding of just how serious his condition was? Unless Bokuto was purposely playing the fool. He must have been, right? Akashi's grip tightened around his phone. He had to be. Akashi. Then I guess I'll see you at the hospital around a week or two from now. I know a gymnasium we can go to. Bokuto. A week or two? Akashi. Is that too long a wait? I can probably reschedule. Bokuto. Nah, it's alright. I guess I can wait that long. I've got time. The words echoed in Akashi's head, as if they've been spoken aloud. He stared down at the screen, his brow furrowing slightly. Did Bokuto know about the lifespan of victims with his condition? Was he just playing the fool after all? Just what kind of guy was he? Indifference morphed into curiosity, and sad curiosity was what drew Akashi closer to his new friend. Akashi. Great. I'll see you then. Akashi! Another 2 weeks has passed and Akashi has seen Bokuto, but this time he waited outside of the hospital, several meters away from the entrance. But Akashi had looked up from his phone and stuffed it into his jacket pocket as the energetic hospital patient made his way across the lot. In no time, Bokuto was standing in front of Akashi, eager in every way to make it to the gymnasium. I haven't set foot outside in weeks. He looked around. The day was strangely chilly. with an occasional breeze every now and then, causing the browning leaves to rustle in the trees above. Those yellow eyes examined everything, adamant with taking all of it in. Bokuto tucked his hands into the pocket of its hood, his shoulders hunching. A puff of smoke came from him as he exhaled. He was paler than before, and the bags under his eyes were darker. Bokuto looked exhausted beyond belief, yet there he stood, excited to make his way to the gymnasium. Akashi hadn't even mustered his first words before Bokuto snapped his head to the side to give him his undivided attention. The gymnasium is about 10 minutes that way. Akashi pointed down the road. Then let's go! Bokuto power walked ahead, obligating Akashi to catch up to him with a quickened pace, whether he wanted to or not. Akashi hadn't even mustered his first words before Bokuto snapped his head to the side to give him his undivided attention. The gymnasium is about 10 minutes away. Akashi pointed down the road. Then let's go! Bokuto power walked ahead, obligating Akashi to catch up to him with a quickened pace, whether he wanted to or not. The sounds of their sneakers squeaking against the gym floor was so memory-inducing. It caused Akashi to take a moment and reminisce on the old days, as if doing so would take him back in time to where he'd play volleyball every single day after school. After a while, he opened his eyes and sighed, then moved across the court to the net. He brought along a volleyball of his own, just in case they weren't provided with any. What used to be your position when you would play? Bokuto asked aloud, finally pulling his hands from his hood pockets. His head was cocked back as he surveyed the gym. Akashi bounced the ball off the floor twice. Setter, you? Bokuto grinned. I was team captain and the ace. He gave a mock swing of his arm as if spiking. Do you think you can toss to me? Of course. Akashi and Bokuto carried a sort of unspoken communication with each other. They had a strange relationship, to say the least. Akashi would answer his questions coldly, with little to no emotion, but Bokuto would cherish these answers and retort with excitement in his tone. He did not seem to take offense easily. Bokuto was very different from everyone else Akashi had ever met before him. Where most people would detach themselves, Bokuto took hold and wouldn't let go, being as persistent as he was energetic. It was very unsettling. Akashi turned away and frowned. I wouldn't have given you my number if you weren't a patient. The black-haired male bounced the ball again and walked over to position. This is all so nostalgic. Bokuto's voice was filled to the brim with excitement. He took several steps back to prepare himself for the toss. Mentally, he was more than ready to spike, but not so much physically. Bokuto missed Akashi's set 12 times. Shit! His frustration was unmasked. Please toss to me again. He threw the ball to Akashi. There's no stopping you, is there? Taking the ball in his hands, Akashi aimed for the approximate location to where Bokuto would spike the ball. He wanted for him to spike at least one, lest Bokuto threw a self-hate-induced panic attack. Watching as Bokuto ran forward, Akashi set the ball perfectly. It brought him back to his high school days. Now only if the sickly one would hit it. The sound of the palm of Bokuto's hand meeting the ball sounded much like an explosion. Akashi flinched. It had been so long since he heard something so loud. It was amazing. Ha! Did you see that? Bokuto was bursting with emotion. He was ecstatic. I spiked it perfectly just now. The toss was perfect. Without hesitation, he ran across the court to retrieve the ball. Akashi knew that running probably wasn't the best thing that he should have been doing, but he said nothing about it. The ball was tossed back to him, and again he got back to tossing the ball for Bokuto. After 3 sets, there was another hit, and another cheer from the former ace. Akashi raised his eyebrows. Impressive. He watched the ball roll further away from them, and expected to see Bokuto trailing it, but instead saw nothing. He turned his attention back to the only other in the room. Bokto stared off in the distance from beyond the net, his face carrying a confused expression. After a moment, quietly, he spoke. "They aren't really there, are they?" The words left his mouth reluctantly. Akashi glanced in the direction where Bokto was staring. No one. They were the only two in the gym. He dug his thumbnail into the side of his index finger and returned his gaze to Bokto. They aren't really here. He has forced himself to say the mere 4 words. Bokto mouthed an "okay" before backing up several steps. "Could you please toss me some more?" "Sure." Akashi nodded once, and that was all that Bokto needed to hear before he ran off to retrieve the ball. At some point during their walk home from the gym, Akashi had agreed for Bokto to spend the night at his house. "My parents are out for a month," he unconsciously said, causing Bokto to go into a begging frenzy to stay over until Akashi said yes. Normally he would have been red with irritation from the sound of such irksome persistence, but the smile that would claim Bokto's face whenever he agreed to something would make Akashi forget about how frustrated he was. He entered his home with Bokto in a matter of minutes, having walked faster than usual. Out there, the sickly one trembled like a newborn animal, even with the extra jacket that Akashi had offered him. "It's warm." Bokto exhaled and shuddered once he was inside, slipping off his shoes. Akashi stepped in and turned his head. "I would hope so." He moved forward. "My room is this way." Bokto followed briskly. He observed his surroundings once again, having been fascinated by the inside of someone else's home. Everything was neat and placed perfectly here and there, giving Akashi's house a warm atmosphere to it. It reminded him of his home. Bokto nearly bumped into Akashi as he stopped to enter his room. "You can sit anywhere." He climbed into bed and folded one leg, pulling over his laptop to start it up. "Is your bed all right?" Bokto pulled off Akashi's jacket. "I said anywhere." Bokto plopped into one of the mattresses right after those words, bumping his head against Akashi's shoulder. He recoiled with a grunt. "Watch it." Akashi shifted to the side to give his visitor more room. Despite this, Bokto was still close enough for their arms to touch. Akashi sighed and lazily dragged his finger along the D-pad. "Do you want to watch a movie?" Bokto curled in on himself and pushed his hand into a hood pocket. "Yeah, anything's fine." His yellow eyes stared at the screen intently. "Okay." Akashi opened the first movie that he had in his computer's memory. He pushed the laptop away and pressed play. "What's it called?" Confused, Bokto glanced over at him. "Cloud Atlas." "How long is it?" "About 3 hours." He kicked his leg out of bed and walked across his room to retrieve a thick blanket that sat bundled up into a rolling chair. He then tossed it to Bokto once he was close enough. "You've been shivering. Use it." Bokto gathered the navy blue blanket in his arms and cautiously threw it around his shoulders. It was soft. "Thank you." He kept his eyes on the screen. "I used to handle the cold better than this." An embarrassed chuckle escaped him. Exhaling through his nostrils, Akashi reclaimed his seat in bed, crossing his legs. "Things happen." "Yeah." Outside, the sky grew dark as clouds rolled in. Bokto quieted himself, curled up, and watched on as the movie started. The sound of rain pelting against the window snapped Akashi back in reality. He looked around in weary haste, but calmed quickly once his memory had returned to him. He nodded off for a brief moment, with his arms crossed and his hands resting on a thick bundle of pillows. With much effort, he sat up to look at Bokto. The movie was well over 2 hours in, nearing its end, and Bokto lay on its side, curled up and clutching the blanket with what little strength he had left. His eyes were half lidded and glued to the screen. his face void of emotion. It almost looked as if he were asleep. Bokuto? Akashi's voice was groggy. Slowly, his yellow eyes scrolled to the side to catch Akashi's gaze. He turned his head weakly and his body along with it. I'm sorry. I've watched this movie so many times, I actually fell asleep. Akashi dragged a hand down his face. Don't be sorry. Bokuto found himself smiling. It's your house. You sleep if you want to. Not if I have a visitor over. It's fine. I'm not just some visitor. After all, we're friends. Bokuto's head lolled to the side, directing his attention back to the movie. You're out for about an hour. Akashi had heaved a sigh. He rubbed the back of his neck. I envy you. I wish I could sleep like that again. Guilt bubbled up within Akashi's chest. He realized just how rude that was, falling asleep so easily in front of a person whose biggest struggle was just that. How insensitive of me. He furrowed his brow, mentally scolding himself. Don't cry over it. Bokuto shifted as he lay down, sticking a leg out to kick Akashi. The movie kept me company. It's very good. Kind of confusing, but good. I'll have to watch it again. Strange. Bokuto was such a strange one. He seems to be unfazed by many things, and blatant about others, blurting sentences out that didn't seem to have much thought behind him. Bokuto doubted that he'd ever have Bokuto over again, so hearing him say, I'll have to watch it again, didn't sit too well with him. Akashi twisted his lips to the side and decided to bring up something else. Are you tired? Exhausted, Bokuto answered honestly. Close your eyes for the time being. Akashi kicked his legs out of bed with much effort and stood on his feet. I'll get us some water. He left the room quickly, leaving Bokuto by his lonesome. After several seconds, he returned to see that Bokuto had changed his position in bed entirely. He lay on his back, with his head on some of Akashi's pillows. His hands rested on his stomach. The dark blanket surrounded him from behind, but slipping off just enough for his torso to be exposed. His head rested against the bed, slumped to the side, facing away from Akashi. Again, if he didn't know any better, Akashi would have figured that Bokuto was already fast asleep. He approached his bedside silently. The room was dark, apart from the soft orange glow that his lamp gave off. He set the drinks down and shuffled into bed, trying not to wake the other. Lying on his back, he stared at the ceiling. No words were exchanged for what seems like forever before Akashi spoke up. How does it feel to not be able to sleep? Bokuto's answer was delayed. Awful. He turned his head in the opposite direction, facing Akashi now. I can barely keep my eyes open by day and can barely keep them closed by night, he snorted in laughter. Does it frustrate you? It did at first, when I didn't understand why, but now I'm kind of okay with it. A hand reached up to push through his own messy locks. I still miss it though, sleeping, dreaming. Akashi watched Bokuto, listening to every word he said. I used to have some insane dreams too, especially before certain volleyball matches. He laughed again, louder this time. I dreamed that I mess up during a spike and then I wake up fuming and would constantly tell myself that I was the best. Do you still think that you are the best? Emerald eyes searched Bokuto's own for an honest answer. He sighed his response with a grin. Yeah. Bokuto closed his eyes after that, one hand resting on the side of his head. He was obviously tired, showing signs of exhaustion with every small move he made. Akashi grew silent and knitted his fingers together on his stomach, his head relaxing into his pillow. The both of them didn't exchange any words after that, ending the conversation just as suddenly as it had started. 2 hours had passed since their last words towards each other, yet Akashi still lay awake in bed. Unknown to Bokuto, he watched him quietly through almost closed eyelids, his thick lashes being enough to hide the fact that he was still awake. Tired, but awake. Akashi couldn't sleep, but it wasn't because of his unfamiliarity with Bokuto that caused this. He couldn't sleep because of his honest fascination with him. Bokuto would lay still for quite a while, his head tilted to the side with one hand on his stomach and the other at his side. When he was like this, Akashi would think that he was resting, and he would always believe that thought until Bokuto would twitch awake again, his body jerking him from what little relaxation he tried to achieve. At first, Akashi thought nothing of it. Bokuto would wince and snap back into reality the way someone would when they dreamt they were falling. But Akashi knew full well that such a thing wasn't possible with Bokuto's condition. It made Akashi pity him, to say the least. 3 times, Bokuto jolted awake involuntarily, and 3 times he covered his eyes with his forearm and heaved a quiet sigh. Akashi refused to have reacted to those moments, hoping to spare his visitor the embarrassment of him having seen that. He intended on closing his eyes and falling asleep for real afterwards, but after having felt his mattress shake for the 4th time, he opened his eyes. Akashi lifted himself onto his elbows. "Bokuto," he whispered. Alarmed, he snapped around quickly. His face looked both shocked and exhausted at the same time. "Akashi, don't." His voice a mere murmur. Akashi moved closer to Bokuto, then resumed to lie down on his back, his head slightly elevated with the pillows that sat behind him. "Don't apologize." Mildly embarrassed, Bokuto looked away and rubbed his arms. "Come." Akashi beckoned for his visitor. Turning his attention back to him, Bokuto met Akashi's gaze. He wore a confused expression, wondering just what the other had meant by that word. "I said come." He motioned for Bokuto to come closer. "Get over here." As Akashi said this, he held out an arm, as if readying himself for some sort of hug. Obeying with hesitance, Bokuto shifted towards Akashi and lay against him, fitting into the curve of his arm. It was no doubt that he was larger than Akashi, but that didn't stop him from fitting in just right. Bokuto's head lay against Akashi's shoulder. Akashi's arm cautiously wrapped himself around Bokuto's broad shoulders. Neither of them said a word. Minutes passed, and in time, Akashi could feel Bokuto relaxing against him, the signs of fatigue finally wearing him down. His head slumped against his shoulder, and both his hands rested on his stomach. He was trying so hard to fit in that small amount of sleep that would get him through the next day, and Akashi wanted to help. As much as he didn't want to believe it, Akashi wanted so badly to help. Why? Akashi watched as one of Bokuto's hands twitched involuntarily, and to his dismay, it wouldn't stop. Slowly, he reached a hand out and closed it over the twitching one, his 4 fingers fitting into Bokuto's palm. In seconds, his hand was calm again. Akashi inhaled quickly and quietly. He watched as Bokuto's chest rose and fell with each breath that kept him alive. His breathing was controlled, much like one of a person's who was actually asleep. Pursuing his lips, Akashi let his head fall back into the pillows. He turned his head to the side towards Bokuto's. He could smell his faint scent. It smelled sort of like a hospital. Akashi made his way to the hospital for the umpteenth time that week, his hands in his jacket pockets and his nose burying into a burgundy knit scarf that protected him from the chilly weather. It had been 2 months since Bokuto's visit over his home, and ever since then, Akashi found that making his way to the hospital had become a daily routine for him. And even if he didn't show up, he would still spend his days sending messages to Bokuto, be it text, email, or the occasional video chat. He exhaled through his nose and entered the hospital, greeting the woman at the front desk, who now knew him by name, and removed the scarf from around his neck. Akashi already knew where he had to go. He ascended those familiar steps, said hello to the familiar faces, and rounded that familiar corner he knew would lead him to Bokuto's room. Another breath escaped him, slow and casual, but he'd soon learn to hold his breath when he noticed another person sitting outside in the hall, several feet from the room, where visitors would spend their time. Akashi eyeballed the small male for a long second, knowing that he wouldn't look up to catch him. His head hung low, and his attention belonged only to the handheld system that entertained him. Normally, Akashi would have walked away in that instant in order to pay Bokuto a visit, but as he neared his room, he could hear two voices coming from within. One of the voices belonged to Bokuto, the other he had no clue. Akashi paused and gripped the strap of his bag. Hesitating, he turned, pivoting on one foot to stare back at the small one who sat by his lonesome. Feeling that it would be rude to interrupt Bokuto's conversation with whoever the other person was, Akashi strode over to the seats and sat one chair away from the gaming stranger. Akashi tapped his fingers quietly against his palm. "Are you here to see Bokuto Kotaro?" Akashi asked in a level tone. "No, my friend is," the other spoke in a quiet voice, low and brooding. Or maybe not brooding, but more along the lines of apathetic. The nickname popped into Akashi's head for a brief second. He wasn't sure why. "Is your friend a friend of Bokuto's?" "Yeah, an old friend." He pressed pause on his PSP and tapped one end against his open palm. "They used to play volleyball together. They go back a couple of years." Akashi leaned back in his seat. "Ah, I see." He felt the need to keep most of his questions at bay. His company did not seem like the type to socialize so openly, so he figured simple inquiries would do just fine, especially if he kept them to a minimum. "May I ask your name?" Akashi took a shot at it. A small thumb rubbed at the system screen to remove a smudge. He looked up, gazed at Akashi past his bleached blonde bangs, and straightened his back in the slightest way possible. "Kozume Kenma." "Akashi Keiji." He felt like he could enjoy Kozume's company, with how his words lacked all form of emotion. "It's nice to meet you, Kozume." "Kenma's fine." He looked back down at the game screen. "Likewise." Akashi nodded, glad to make an acquaintance, and would have relaxed into his seat if not for a sudden disembodied voice that startled him soon after Kenma's sentence. "Hey Kenma, who are you talking to?" As if straight from a cartoon, out popped this tall male from Bokuto's room, with stark black hair that both hung over his face and stuck out in all directions. He carried a look on his face that made him seem more sinister than sincere, and his eyes flitted from Kenma to Akashi and then back to Kenma. "This is Akashi. I just met him." His words were as straightforward as they were indifferent. "Akashi?" Bokuto's voice rang out from the room this time. Akashi didn't even have to see his face to know that Bokuto was beaming. "Is he here? Is he here?" "I am." Akashi rose from his seat to enter the room, but instead found Bokuto standing at the door in seconds, his eyes wide with surprise. He was thinner than before, a large flannel shirt fitting him loosely. He had probably lost a bit over 20 pounds in the 2 months that passed. Akashi frowned. "Get back into bed, you shouldn't be..." Bokuto didn't allow him to finish his sentence as he embraced Akashi suddenly. "I didn't think you were going to make it today." Though he got thinner, his arms still had some power in them. He squeezed Akashi, mashing him closer until he could barely breathe. Akashi's eyebrows knit together. "I told you I would," he all but murmured against Bokuto's shoulder. "What's this?" The taller, dark-haired male gestured to them. I come to visit and I'm barely paid attention to, but when he comes along, he's given the whole package? Bokuto pulled away to face his smirking friend. Relax. He then turned his attention to Akashi. This is Kuho, a close friend of mine. He cocked his head to the side. Nice to meet you, Akashi. I've heard a lot about you in the short hour that I've been here. Nodding once, Akashi acknowledged Kuho's words, but did not know how to respond to them. All he had to offer was "the pleasure's mine," before moving forward to try and usher Bokuto back into his room. Hey! Bokuto resisted, standing firm in place. We were actually just talking about stepping outside. Well, I brought it up just as a suggestion, but then he got really excited. Kuro scratched the back of his head. So we were going to step outside for a minute or two in order to get this owl to shut up. I've been cooped up in this place for too long. I haven't gone outside in days. The discomfort could be heard in Bokuto's voice. If there was one thing that Akashi had learned about Bokuto in the little time that he'd known him, it was that he wasn't too fond of staying locked up indoors. Maybe taking him outside for a while would do him some good. Akashi looked down the hall. Let's go then, to the garden in the back. Everyone came to an unspoken agreement after the one sentence. Kuho started down the hall, Bokuto trailing after him. Akashi followed after, knowing that Kenma was nearby. As he walked, he stared at the backs of the two men in front of him. They both seemed to be the same height, but Akashi couldn't help but realize that Bokuto looked just a bit smaller. A mere 2 minutes outside had turned into 2 hours. Akashi shared a bench with Kenma. The both of them sat down long ago, leaving Bokuto and Kuho to their own business as they wandered about and waved their arms around in their animated way of speaking. He found it strange how Bokuto was the one walking around when he was the sick one out of the lot. He furrowed his brow and exhaled heavily, his eyes looking down. He stared at his knees intensely before Kenma spoke up. You don't like to see him like that, do you? Akashi lifted his head and looked to his side. He eyed the blonde one for quite a while. Kenma didn't give him a second chance to respond. I don't like to see him like that either. That's why I didn't want to come along, but Kuho insisted. Kenma's unconcerned tone contradicted his words, but something told Akashi that he had meant everything that he was saying. Were you ever friends with Bokuto? Akashi lifted his head in subtle interest. More like acquaintances. Our teams would face each other often. Whenever we did, Kuho and Bokuto would meet up afterwards and spend time together. I'm usually around Kuho, so... He shrugged with little energy. I sort of got to know him through Kuho's company. He's an okay guy. Loud, though. Bokuto's disembodied laughter rang throughout the garden, as if to prove Kenma right. Akashi almost smiled. So, how are you taking all of this, if I may ask? Kenma's lips puckered in thought. I'm taking well, or at least I think I am. I'm trying to detach myself. It's another reason why I didn't want to pay Bokuto any visits. He looked down, his hair hanging over his face. There's something about Bokuto that doesn't sit well with me. Confused and mildly shocked, Akashi made a face. Is there something wrong with him? Has he ever done something bad? Not to my knowledge, but if he has, that's not what I meant. Kenma rubbed his nose with his sleeve. It doesn't matter if you've never met Bokuto before, or if you haven't seen him in 10 days, or 10 weeks, or 10 months, or 10 years. If you've ever interacted with him in even the slightest, you'll be reminded of how good a person he really is. Akashi stared at Kenma, speechless. He's genuine, kind, and at times infantile, but that's what makes him so likable, I suppose. He drags you back in. He praises others while shouting that he's the best at everything he does. It's ridiculous. Looking away slowly, Akashi watched as Bokuto and Kuro reappeared in the distance. They were still wrapped up in whatever conversation they were having. Kuro looks happy now, but he wasn't back then. Kemma almost murmured the words. Akashi turned to catch a glimpse of him, but he stared off in the distance, his eyes not focusing on anything in particular. Blinking, Akashi turned his attention back to Bokuto and Kuro. 5 weeks ago, he was in shambles. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He only accepted my company, and I was the only one willing to give it to him. He continues to stare on as he talked. That was when he learned about the disease. This entire past month hasn't been any different for him, though. He didn't want to come today either. No one likes to find out that someone they care about is sick, much less diagnosed with a disease that cannot be cured. Bokuto and Kuro continued to talk animatedly, the both of them out of earshot. Bokuto is starting to look less and less like his old self too. He used to be thicker, he used to be bigger than Kuro, but now he's the one who's smaller. Kuro is the bigger one. Kuro is the heavier one. It doesn't make any sense. Pursing his lips into a thin line, Akashi looked down and noticed that Kenma has laced his fingers together. He pulled and tugged at them restlessly. His hands showed that what his face dared not. Akashi figured it was safe to say that Bokuto had already begun to pull Kenma back in. It was an awful thing to do, but Akashi knew full well that none of it was intentional on Bokuto's part. All he had to do was to talk to someone, and in an instant they would be involved in Bokuto's lively shenanigans once again. Akashi knew this. The same thing happened to him some 2.5 months ago. If he had known that sending simple text messages would have turned into daily hospital visits, then he would have never handed over his cell number. This was not what he wanted. He wanted healthy friends that could talk to him on a regular basis, not one sick friend who he'd have to invest personal and emotional time into. Akashi swallowed thickly and crossed his arms, rubbing over one thumb over the other. He stared at Bokuto and found it difficult to look away. With a heavy heart, he spoke. I wish I never met him. A cool breeze passed through the garden just then, and in the distance, Bokuto held on tightly to the burgundy knit scarf around his neck to keep warm. In time, Kuro and Genma found that it was time for them to make their way back home. Kuro bid Bokuto farewell for the time being, while Genma made his way downstairs to exit the building. He didn't seem like one to say goodbye, or hello for that matter, so both Akashi and Bokuto didn't pay any mind to it. Kuro finally left the room after 4 minutes or so, having forgotten that he was supposed to leave in the first place. He waved and jogged out, knowing that if he didn't hurry, he'd have to spend several more minutes trying to catch up with a wandering Kenma. Standing at the side of Bokuto's bed, Akashi glanced to the open door that led to the hallway. Your friend's a lot like you. Anything but, Bokuto retorted, sitting upright in bed. He's a bit more of an ass, to say the least. He chuckled and rubbed at his face wearily. The sound of Bokuto's laughter caused Akashi to turn his head back to him. It was a reaction that Akashi was not expecting, to say in the least, but he played off his surprise and only managed an I see. Bokuto gazed at Akashi, almost in wonder. Why are you standing? Take a seat. He patted the empty space next to him animatedly. No, it's all right. I was actually thinking of taking my leave soon as well. What? Why? The disappointment in his voice was clear. You've only been here for like 30 minutes. Akashi scratched his head. It's been over 3 hours, actually. That's the same thing. Bokuto moved closer to where Akashi was standing, all while still sitting in bed. I spoke to Kuro most of the time, so it doesn't count. What doesn't? The 3 hours! He was getting frustrated. I'm very bad at measuring time now, too, if you haven't noticed. 3 hours feels like 7 hours sometimes, but 3 hours can also feel like 7 minutes. I may not be as sharp as I used to, but that whole time flies when you're having fun rule still applies to me, even today. So 3 hours is nothing, Akashi muttered. Exactly. Bokuto's eyes lit up again. Akashi avoided looking into them. I understand, but I still have to go. He avoided looking at Bokuto altogether. I would stay if it were up to me. I've just got something to take care of. But I'll be sure to visit you tomorrow. Bokuto didn't make a sound. He pressed his lips into a thin line and fell backwards on his bed. He probably had 1,000 things to say, but he kept them all at bay and instead rolled to his side, facing away from Akashi. He was shocked. Akashi never knew that Bokuto was one to suddenly sulk on a dime. He looked around and frowned, and figured it would be best to take his leave. I'll see you tomorrow. Do you want your scarf back? The question came out of the blue. Despite him being the one who asked, Bokuto held onto it tightly. Akashi watched him and zipped up his jacket. Yeah, I do. In dismay, Bokuto sat up in bed and slowly reached around his neck to pull off the worn piece of cloth. He took his time, the thought of removing it killing him faster than disease itself. But I also want you to hold on to it. The words had come as such a shock to Bokuto that he paused and looked up at Akashi. His hands tensed, relaxed, and rested against his neck. You do? Yes. Akashi managed the faintest of smiles. Please hold on to it, Bokuto. At that moment, he turned away and walked off, feeling he wouldn't be able to leave if he lasted one more second in the room. Akashi awoke with a start that same night, his strangled shout having pulled him from his sleep. He flinched hard and sat up quickly, closing his hands over his mouth to subdue the almost hysteric sounds that came from him. His breathing was heavy, heart rate quicker than usual. Akashi could feel his heart pounding in his throat, making it difficult to swallow. Shit. That had been the 5th time that month where Akashi had to tear himself out of another nightmare. They made him feel nauseous to a point where he had to sit up in bed and swallow deep. Slow breaths in order to cool himself down. And he did just that, reaching hands up to rub at his eyes before taking an intense look around his room. Exhaling heavily, Akashi turned to look at the desk near his bed. His phone was there, hesitating for only a second. He reached his hand out and took the device into his hands. When the screen lit up, a text message from Bokuto waited there for him. Sleep well, Akashi. It had been sent 2 hours ago. Akashi swiped and unlocked his phone with trembling hands. From Akashi, sent at 2:47 a.m. Are you there? Bokuto. Yeah, Akashi, I thought you were asleep. Akashi had to wait almost a minute for Bokuto's response. It was the longest minute he'd ever been forced to sit through. Akashi. I woke up. Nightmares. Bokuto. Nightmare? You had a nightmare? Was it bad? Akashi. Well, it managed to wake me up. Bokuto. The quiet kind of wake up? Akashi. No, more like the cliche kind where you sit up in bed in the cold sweat. Bokuto. Are you calming down? Are you feeling better? Akashi stared at the text message and let out a shaking sigh. Judging by his still trembling hands, he knew he wasn't. Akashi. Yeah, I'm just a little shaken. Bokuto. I don't believe you on that yeah part. Akashi. I'm fine, Bokuto. Alright, well, we'll just see about that. Furrowing his brow, Akashi stared at the phone screen and laid his head down sideways. It wasn't like Bokuto to question what he said in such a straightforward fashion. Akashi, there's nothing to see. He pressed send and watched the phone carefully. waiting for the small ellipses to appear on the lower left of the screen, but instead he was greeted with nothing. He didn't get a response, nor did he see any signs of responding. Akashi frowned and left his phone screen alone to dim and blacken. He held it in his shaking hands and closed his eyes in an attempt to try and find sleep again. It was difficult. However, as each time he tried to drift off to sleep, that unnerving fear of having the same dream would jerk him back awake. Akashi groaned softly and covered his face. Zzz. Akashi's phone vibrated against his forehead. He flinched and pulled his hand away to stare at the screen. Bokuto, look outside! What? Akashi kicked his legs out of bed and strode to his window. Impossible. He pulled out the blinds and looked down. Out in the dead of the night stood Bokuto, with a burgundy knit scarf around his neck, a jacket, jeans, and slippers. He looked up and grinned, and waved wildly in Akashi's direction. Akashi's eyes widened. No. He pulled away from the windowsill and ran out of his room, straight downstairs and to the front door. He threw it open and faced Bokuto, who was jogging to him with a smile and a shiver in each step. May I come in? No, Why not? We're going back to the hospital right now. I'm taking you back. Akashi reached his arms out and pushed Bokuto away. What? No! Bokuto refused to budge. He pushed Akashi back this time. I just came from there. Exactly, because you belong there. Akashi felt that his words were a bit bitter, but he had no other way of telling Bokuto the truth. You're sick. You need medical attention. So I can't sleep. Bokuto swatted Akashi's hands away. What's the big deal? It's more than that. He exerted more force into his arms, getting Bokuto to take a step back. You've had 2 panic attacks this week already, and your hallucinations are getting worse. My home's not a place for you to be right now. I get panic attacks when you're not around, Bokuto answered simple-mindedly, and my hallucinations aren't all that bad. Akashi clenched his jaw behind the mildly irritated face. Stop trying to act this isn't such a big deal. You may not think it is, but Let's just go. I don't want to. Bokuto grabbed Akashi's hand with his own. Bokuto, stop. I don't want to go back. How'd you even sneak out? By sneaking out, they don't pay much attention to me anyways. Akashi yanked his hands away and stared at Bokuto. As much as it infuriated him, he knew that Bokuto wasn't going to go anywhere unless he let him come into his home first. He swallowed thickly. Get inside. Akashi stepped to the side. Bokuto's eyes did the familiar light-up thing as he bounded into Akashi's home. He removed his slippers and waited at the entrance for his friend to enter. Akashi stepped in and shut the door behind him. You chose the perfect night, Akashi said bitterly as he hobbled up the stairs. My parents aren't home. It's not like I would have made any noise, Bokuto at all but shouted. Follow me after him. Akashi sighed. I'll get you back to the hospital by 7 in the morning. Fine by me. Imagine the looks on their face when they see me coming in from the outside. Imagine their face when they notice I'm not even in my room. Bokuto was elated. Akashi entered his room and shut the door behind Bokuto. I'm going straight to sleep. But I thought you had a nightmare? Bokuto stood at the side of his bed. I did. He paused for a moment. Is that why you came here? Because of the nightmare? Bokuto stared at Akashi. Because you said you were okay, and I knew you weren't. Akashi was at a loss for words. He returned Bokuto's gaze, then looked down quickly afterwards. A hand tugged at his shirt weakly. I see. He reached a hand out to turn on the lamp that sat on his nightstand. Taking a seat on the edge of the bed, Bokuto rubbed the back of his neck. What was the dream about? Akashi sat in bed and wrapped a sheet around himself. He tossed the navy blue one to Bokuto, remembering how fond he was of the last time he'd come over. He watched as Bokuto gathered it up in his arms and threw it around himself. He then stared at Akashi, waiting for his response. He sighed. I was drowning. His hand picked at the small lint rolls that stuck to his sheet. Drowning in something black, sort of like tar. I was fighting and trying to get out, but I had no power over it whatsoever. I was so weak, and it got to the point where I could barely breathe. My face was the only thing sticking out. Akashi cocked his head back to demonstrate this, with his fingers tapping his chin. I was struggling, but in the end I couldn't move. I was shouting, but no sound came out. No one could hear me. No one was around. Akashi shrugged. The liquid started flooding into my mouth and nose, and it wasn't until I was suffocating that I forced myself awake. Akashi didn't say another word afterwards. He only bundled himself up in the sheets that surrounded him. He turned his head to look out the window, seeing the moon timidly. Shifting in his seat, Bokuto pulled himself closer to Akashi, one hand grasping the blanket that had been given to him. Akashi remained in place with the thought in mind that Bokuto would respect his personal space and sit a foot or two away from him. But to his apparent surprise, Bokuto leaned his head on Akashi's shoulder and slipped an arm around him. Akashi squirmed in discomfort. What are you doing? Comforting? Bokuto replied, lifting his head. Isn't that what humans do? Akashi watched him carefully. Don't talk like you aren't one. Bokuto chortled quietly and placed his head back on Akashi's shoulder. They didn't speak for a moment, and the room was filled with the hushed sound of the outside. Hey, what? Let's watch Cloud Atlas. No, Akashi shook his head. Bokuto grumbled to himself. Why not? Don't you have it in your laptop? I do, but I don't want to watch it. It's a long movie, and I've watched it about 7 times already. Well, if you watched it 7 times, then why not watch it an 8th time? Because it's 3 in the morning, and I want to fit some sleep into my schedule. By the time the movie ends, it'll be 6, and then I'll have to walk you to the hospital before doctors find out you're missing and lose their minds. A laugh escaped Bokuto, the sound curling his lips into a smile. What if they've already found out? Then that would be a problem. And they'd turn my room upside down in the attempt to find me. That'd be a tough mess to clean up. Turning his head, Bokuto looked at Akashi. Everything you say is so straightforward. Why is that? I don't know. Akashi inhaled slowly. It's just how I am. Sometimes I think I'm funny, but other people never laugh at my jokes. Bokuto snorted. Have you ever tried to make a joke? When I said that it would be a tough mess to clean up for them, Akashi sounded genuinely confused. Didn't that come off as remotely funny? Bokuto couldn't help but guffaw, his head tilting back. That was your idea of a joke? You're too loud. Be quiet. Akashi shoved his visitor slightly. Despite this, it only seemed to make Bokuto laugh even harder. Akashi pursed his lips in frustration, but this quickly vanished as a small laugh fell from his lips. Well, you're laughing now. He tried to hide his smile. So I guess I am pretty good at being funny. Bokuto glanced at him. Yeah, but for all the wrong reasons. His laughter died down along with Akashi's. You know, I don't think I've ever heard you laugh, or seen you smile for that matter. Shrugging one shoulder, Akashi grabbed his phone. Well, now I have. Bokuto looked over at the phone screen. What are you doing? Setting an alarm for 6 a.m.? Akashi set his phone down and leaned back slowly, resting the back of his head against his pillow. Bokuto followed, his arm still around him. This is strange. He stared up at the ceiling and sighed. Why do I let them do this? Akashi's head slumped to the side, in Bokuto's direction. I hope you don't mind me sleeping. He whispered the words. Of course I don't. I showed up to your house unannounced at 3 in the morning, so you've got all the right sleep. I just hope it isn't. Bokuto's arm unconsciously squeezed Akashi closer to his side. All right. He closed his eyes. Good night. Akashi pulled his arms in close, wrapping the sheets around himself. See you in 3 hours, Bokuto whispered. Complete and utter silence befell them afterwards. Akashi had kept his eyes closed for quite a while, trying to fall into a deep sleep, but found that he couldn't, or at least not as quickly as he thought he would. He kept his breathing controlled and steady for about 40 minutes. He looked sound asleep, but was actually drifting between the real world and the dream realm. There was silence, and then there was a sound, a subtle, gentle sound. The sound of someone cautiously moving their arm when they didn't want to wake someone. Akashi remained in his faux sleeping position, feeling that it would take much more of an effort for him to open his eyes and check around than stay dormant. And so he continues to try and grasp sleep, expecting nothing from the noise. It was because of this that he was so surprised when he felt a gentle sensation against his forehead. It took all of his power to not flinch when he felt the unfamiliar touch. They were fingers, hesitant fingers that ghosted over Akashi's forehead in order to push a loose strand of hair away. Keeping his eyes closed, Akashi took in the feeling of this. He could sense the heavy amount of reluctance in each movement that Bokuto's hand carried out. Bokuto was afraid to wake Akashi, so much that his hand trembled slightly whenever he pushed Akashi's long bangs away. Slowly but gradually, Akashi's heart rate picked up. His hand twitched once and he moved closer, leaning into Bokuto's touch. This backfired, however, as the other hand quickly withdrew. Akashi relaxed then, keeping the sleeping act alive. Bokuto did not move a muscle after seeing Akashi stir. The last thing he wanted to do was to wake him up, so they lay in silence for minutes on end. Akashi figured that Bokuto would keep to himself for the rest of the night, so he put his focus back to trying to sleep. He held the same position and felt himself dozing off. I'm sorry. The words were barely above a whisper, and they came out without warning. It almost sounded as if Bokuto was talking to himself. Akashi remained still and silent. I never meant to drag you into my life. Bokuto inhaled all that he could. Akashi felt his chest rise. He could practically hear the frown in his voice. I know that I'm unbearable. I know that I'm a lost cause. I know that you know that too. Yet you still stick by me. He paused for a moment, then spoke up again. His voice was a soft tremor. So, thank you. Bokuto had nothing more to say after that. He lay his cheek on the top of Akashi's head and kept still, daring not to wake him. But Akashi couldn't find it in him to sleep. Bokuto's words haunted him, and they repeated themselves over and over in his mind. He swallowed once, hoping to get rid of the lump in his throat. After that night, things had only gone downhill from then. Akashi took a glance out the window, only to instantly throw on his clothes and toss his bag over his shoulders. He jogged downstairs, slipping his shoes on, and was out the door in seconds, making his way down the familiar route to the hospital. Above, the clouds were dense, and they gathered quickly, casting a dark shroud over Akashi's path. He zipped his jacket up to shield himself from the harsh winds that came his way and advanced forward. There was definitely a storm coming his way, so Akashi knew that Bokuto would need him. A month and 16 days had passed since Bokuto's final visit to Akashi's home. And once he'd been taken back to the hospital, the doctors and nurses made sure to keep a closer eye on him, and with good reason. Not only was Bokuto the kind of guy to sneak out when no one was watching, but his condition had quickly begun to worsen without warning. Before then, he would normally lose several pounds a week, but ever since the night he snuck out, his weight loss could only be described as alarming. In the span of a little over a month, Bokto had gone from a general 150 pounds to a mere 97 pounds. Last time they weighed him, the drastic weight loss was awful enough, but as if to add insult to injury, Bokto's worsening conditions also made it increasingly difficult for him to walk, move, and speak. Akashi frowned heavily as he entered the hospital. He made his way up the same path, walking swiftly and without pause. That was until he saw a familiar face. Kuro? Akashi stopped in his tracks, in front of Bokuto's room. The black-haired male looked up from his hands. He faked a smile. Hey, Akashi, right? Long time. Yeah, He turned his head. Is there someone in there? He didn't wait for Kuro to respond and glanced into Bokuto's room. Surely enough, he noticed Kenma sitting in a seat next to Bokuto's bed. His back was facing the door, and Bokuto seemed to have all of his attention on him. Will Kenma allow me to enter the room? Kuro rubbed the lower part of his face with his hand. Nope. He leaned back in his chair. Take a seat. Kenma usually isn't the kind of person to speak to people one-on-one, so I think you better leave him alone. Inhaling deeply, Akashi lingered in place, then sat down in the empty seat next to Kuro. You seem a bit anxious. Kuro looked at Akashi sideways. I am. There's a storm incoming. Bokuto doesn't do well with those. Bokuto? Kuro looked at the ceiling, as if he would be able to see the clouds from there. I hadn't noticed that one was rolling in. He slowly lowered his head and folded his arms. Didn't think you knew that about him. Akashi turned his head to face Kuro. Was he ever fond of them? Don't think so. In the past, he'd always get sort of tense and paranoid whenever a storm would pass overhead. But that was kind of it. Now I bet he suffers panic attacks because of them. Akashi looked down. He does. Storms trigger them. Kuro made a grunting noise and had nothing more to say on the subject. Akashi figured he would stay quiet too. He knit his fingers together and kept his eyes down, anticipating when the first boom of thunder would sound. He would have to close both those blinds and take his mind off it somehow. Show him a movie or playing a game with him that would result in him to calm down quickly. Akashi rubbed the back of his neck hastily and closed his eyes. 97 fucking pounds. Startled, Akashi opened his eyes and glanced in Kuro's direction. He glowered at nothing in particular. I'm sorry? 97 pounds, right? That's how much he supposedly weighs now? Once Akashi realized what Kuro was talking about, he instantly felt his spirits fall. Yes. Fucking bullshit. He swore without a filter. Wincing, Akashi turned his head away. He'd only spoken to Kuro once before, and they barely exchanged any words. He didn't know how to deal with him now, so he remained silent. He twisted his fingers and pursed his lips, wary of what Kuro would say next. All of this is so... Why the hell did this have to happen to him? At such an early damn age too? He hissed the words under his breath, openly frustrated with the situation. He turned 20 only 3 months ago. Akashi lowered his head. It's not fair. It's not. Kuro echoed the words in agreement. But here we are, and here he is. Kuro rubbed his elbow, irate and sighed in defeat. I'm not coming back to visit him anymore. Not after this. I've seen enough. He turned to look at Akashi. Keep him company from now on. I don't know how you do it, but when you're around him, you help him forget. Akashi kept his eyes down. He wouldn't show this. but Kuro's words had hit him harder than he could ever imagine. They sat heavily in the pit of his stomach, churning and pestering him, urging him to throw up. But he only swallowed and kept his composure, just as he been doing since the day he met Bokuto. Akashi reached his hand up to rub the back of his neck roughly, administering a feeling of discomfort to one area in order to ignore the pain that threatened to swallow his heart. He closed his eye in a slow blink and kept his breathing quiet. Having been neck-deep in his own sorrows, Kuro was blind to Akashi's. He forced himself to stand after some time, tapping his fingers against his pants. "Keep doing what you're doing." His voice was low. Akashi nodded in response. "Of course, I couldn't stop even if I tried." A biting chuckle escaped Kuro. "Yeah, ain't that the horror of it all?" He rubbed his chin and stalked his way down the hall. "Keep in touch, Akashi." "Of course." He repeated the same phrase, finding that it was difficult to search for words at the time. He watched as Kuro walked away, far enough for small details to become blurred. He only looked like a tall, thin, black mass now as he stood near the stairway. He was waiting for Kenma, but Akashi wondered why he hadn't waited for him in the seat that he was initially sitting in. Just then, as Akashi bit down on the inside of his lower lip, he turned his head in time to catch a glimpse of Kenma lowering his head towards Bokuto. It wasn't necessarily a bow, it seemed more along the lines of an act of affection, or at least as affectionate as Kenma could get, which wasn't much. He touched his forehead to Bokuto's shoulder, which only earned a laugh from him. Bokuto talked quietly in response to Kenma, gave a nod, and smiled. He never seemed to stop smiling. Once he saw this, Kenma picked himself up from his seat, put his hands at his side, and bowed his head. He didn't last another second in Bokuto's company before he turned and briskly walked out of the room. He kept his head down and played the fool, pretending he didn't see Akashi. In seconds, Kenma was down the hall and making his way down the stairs, having completely ignored Kuro as well. Kuro didn't seem surprised in the slightest. He only waved goodbye at the staring Akashi before following his small friend down the stairs. Hesitantly, Akashi barely managed to wave back before he heard his name being called from that all-too-familiar room, by that all-too-familiar voice. He directed his attention to a grinning Bokuto who eagerly sat up in bed. Akashi almost smiled back, and he would have too, if it had been for the thunder that sounded its arrival from above. He watched as Bokuto's smile faded instantly, his eyes having gone from half-lidded to wide in a second. His hands squeezed tightly around the navy blue blanket that enveloped him. "Akashi, I know." He walked ahead quickly, straight into the room. He pushed the chair away and found Bokuto's side in bed. Frail, shaking fingers pushed through his own black and white hair in an attempt to calm himself down, but another thunderclap sounded, louder that time. Bokuto flinched hard enough to make the bed shake. "Fuck!" His voice broke in terror. "Look at me. It's going to be fine." Akashi spoke in a calm, slow voice. His hand took Bokuto's own, and he held it gently. It was cold and shook in short bursts. "You'll get through this. You always do." Staring down wide-eyed at the floor of the hospital room, Bokuto fought to find words. "Akashi, don't..." Bokuto struggled with his breathing. "Don't what?" "Don't leave me." "I won't leave you." He moved closer, his other hand taking hold of Bokuto's. "Just breathe with me." Bokuto nodded frantically and forced himself to comply with Akashi, as he always did. He was the only person who could get him through those horrible moments after all. Heavy raindrops pelted against the window as Bokuto's frantic sounds filled the room. Akashi was glad to have made it in time. That had been one of Bokuto's worst attacks yet. Hey, Akashi? When do you think it will snow? I don't know, snow falls at random. Yeah, but do you think it will snow soon? Or maybe January? I hope so. That would be nice. Tokyo needs a little snow now and then. Yeah, when it falls, I want to go out and stand in it. Akashi sat cross-legged in the seat adjacent to Bokuto's bed. He looked up at the sickly one when he said those words, trying to meet his gaze, but ultimately finding no yellow eyes to look into. Bokuto had his head turned away. He was staring outside at the white clouds that shrouded the skies, mesmerized by just how colorless it had made everything seem. It was one of those white days, as Bokuto liked to call them, so he paid more attention to the world beyond the glass than he did to his own confined life in the hospital. Bokuto breathed in deeply, the sound filling the small space around them. The bedsheets crumbled beneath his hands. Are you sure you should be going out in the cold like that? I think I can handle it. Akashi didn't want to bring up the fact that Bokuto probably would no longer possess the ability to walk by the time any snow did get a chance to fall, so he kept his mouth shut. He rubbed his hands together weakly and tilted his head to the side. I guess you can, just as long as you're feeling better. Bokuto scoffed. It was a quiet sound. I am. Stop asking already. That was 6 days ago. I know, but it was bad. It passed. Bokuto turned his head, the pillow crumbling under his neck. He looked at Akashi with heavy-lidded eyes. He was extremely pale and somehow thinner than before, but he kept that same smile on his face. I'm fine now. Akashi couldn't help but smile back at him. He leaned his chin against the palm of his hand and chortled. Or at least as fine as you can get. Bokuto stared at Akashi sharply. His lips quivered before he could form his words. Shuts up. A stronger laugh broke out of him, rattling his body as he lay down in bed. I look like shit, I know. Akashi found himself laughing along with him. His quiet chuckle was louder than Bokuto's wholehearted laugh. You don't look like shit. He tried to hide his grin with his hand, but it was still visible from the gaps between his fingers. Bokuto reached a hand out, aimlessly trying to swat Akashi's own hand away. He tried to aim for it at the very least, but found it difficult to. Still, he continued. Don't cover that. Cover what? Your smile. Why, it isn't anything I barely ever see it. Bokuto's fingers touched at Akashi's knuckles. That was enough for Akashi to remove his hand from his mouth, slowly, moving it to rest over his chin. He smiled down at him. Bokuto's eyes stared forward with an engrossed gaze, his yellow hues taking a mental picture of what he probably would never see again. Many words dashed through his mind, but he could only think of 3 that would be best for him to say to Akashi. He tried to open his mouth to say them, but he performed another action instead. Unconsciously, his hand grasped Akashi's own, and he dragged it down with his lack of strength, causing both of them to start. Bokuto's eyes widened. I thought you would hold it up. It was sudden. Akashi stifled a laugh. It caught me off guard. I didn't mean to. It's all right. He soothed his thumb over Bokuto's knuckles. I'm holding it now. Silently and almost in fascination, Bokuto stared at Akashi once again, longer this time, before he looked up, then down, then away. He turned his head towards the window, away from Akashi. He couldn't face him. Pursing his lips timidly, Akashi ceased to speak. He studied the back of Bokuto's head, eyeing the messy strands of black and white hair that overlapped each other. His green eyes then fell to study his paling skin. His veins were easily noticeable now, and they bulged from beneath his flesh whenever he moved. Akashi His eyes lowered, focusing on the arm that was attached to the hand that he was holding. He studied the small needle that was lodged into Bokto's forearm, eyed the thin tube that was attached to this, and followed it up to the bag of IV fluid that hung above its head. Whatever was left of Akashi's smile faded. Ever since Bokto's last panic attack, it had suddenly become more difficult for him to control his words, movements, and actions altogether. Such a task as easy as swallowing was now a problem for Bokto too, and after many failed attempts at keeping his foot down or getting it to go down in the first place, the nurses found it would be best if Bokto received nourishment the only other way possible, and that was through a tube. Over a span of 6 days, Akashi found that the only things Bokto could manage to swallow were small snacks like grapes, ice cubes, and Pocky sticks that were specifically strawberry flavored. Other than those things, Bokto found it nearly impossible to stomach anything else. His only other choice was to lie there and accept whatever it was the IV liquid had to offer him. Looking back to Bokto, he was relieved to see that he still had his attention to the window. At some time while Akashi was spacing out, the blue blanket that surrounded Bokto had been pulled up just below his chin, with only his arm hanging out to hold Akashi's hand. Bokto's breathing was quiet, and his hand never really remained still for a long time. It would shake every so often, and each time it did, Akashi would squeeze it slightly in response. This was their unspoken communication. It was Akashi's way of letting Bokto know that everything would be alright, and this would always comfort him, no matter the situation they were in. They found it easier to believe in that lie than to accept the truth of what has to come. On a numbing old day that was January 3rd, at 8:04 p.m., snow had fallen for the first time that year. Bokto was the first to notice, but had also been the last to say anything about it. It wasn't until Akashi looked up from his laptop screen that he realized it was snowing heavily outside. His eyes lit up, intent on informing Bokto, but when he turned his head to get a look at him, instead of being greeted by an over-enthusiastic friend, he was presented with an unfazed expression upon Bokto's weary face. Akashi frowned. "Bokto, don't you see it?" Looking up from the laptop screen, Bokto directed his attention to Akashi. "What? The snow? It's snowing outside." Bokto turned his head to catch another look out the window. Surely enough, snow was falling, and in chunks too, but this time it did not grasp Bokto's attention. Frankly speaking, it had no effect on him in the slightest. He managed a feeble shrug and continued on with the movie that he'd been watching for the 30th time today. Akashi was genuinely confused. "I thought you were waiting for the snow. I thought that was what you wanted?" His eyelids drooping and then snapping open again, Bokto made a small sound. "I see it all the time." Just then, Akashi's lips parted in realization. Bokto's hallucination had become such a part of him that he thought the snow outside was just another mind trick. He breathed in sharply. "It's not a hallucination, Bokto. It's actually snowing." Bokto looked up to stare out the window again. There was a longing in his eyes that Akashi couldn't stand to see. With barely an ounce of strength left, Bokto pulled himself up to get a tad bit better look outside. Curiosity had sparked within him. He wanted to know if it was real or not. He hated how difficult it had become for him to tell apart the real things from the fake ones. "I'll show you." Akashi stood from his seat and walked to the windowsill. There he parted the glass slightly. A gust of icy wind charged its way into the room in an instant, draining the warmth from everything it touched. Bokto's skin crawled, goosebumps pimpling his porcelain surface. He pulled the thick blanket over himself with much effort. Swiftly, Akashi closed the window, having gathered just enough snow off the edge for him to show Bokto. He strode to him quickly, cupping the already melting snow in his hands. Bokto held out his own, eager to see if they were true. See, look. Akashi placed a small, white, compressed lump of snow into Bokto's arm. This earned a gasp from him. Bokto stared down at the white clump of melting ice, and with one finger he pressed against it to watch it fall apart. The tiny snowflakes melted in the warmth of his palm, leaving a small puddle behind. A gasp escaped Bokto, his eyes widening as much as they could. Akashi! I know. Take me outside. It's freezing. Akashi murmured the words and looked Bokto up and down. He was nothing more than a blanket with a head. You tremble when it's 70 degrees in the room. Right now it's about 10 degrees outside. Please, Akashi. Pressing his lips into a thin slab of lime, Akashi shook his head once more. He found it too difficult to say no to Bokto, but it had to be done. I can't. But why? Bokto's spirits fell, his frown deep. That weather will only hurt you. You need to be protected. From what? Bokto stared at Akashi, his features having gone from disappointed to unaccepting. Akashi withdrew a breath, but found that he couldn't say anything. He watched Bokto with a wary gaze, unaware of what he was to say next. I'm already in death row. I can barely speak. I can barely walk. I can't eat. I can't sleep. The last thing you... He clenched his jaw, frustrated with himself and the words he spoke. You need to do is worry about me catching a cold. Bokto, cold or not, I'm still not going to last very long. So please let me have this. His eyes were glued to Akashi's, and Akashi found that he was unable to look away. Bokto's eyes said everything to him. He translated all that his words could not. Akashi looked down and away from Bokto, then back to the window. I think the window will be as far as we can go, he said in a hushed voice. That's fine with me. And just like that, a smile found Bokto's face again. Akashi sighed to himself, frustrated with how easily he'd given in to Bokto's begging. But as he thought of it, he figured he couldn't be blamed for it. He didn't want to be the one to say no to someone who had little to nothing left in his life. There was that, and the fact that Akashi couldn't help but find Bokto's smile endearing, no matter how sickly he looked when he wore one. Come on, Akashi reached a hand out to help Bokto to his feet. He urged him to keep the blanket around him, but Bokto insisted that he leave it behind. He held onto the IV stand with one hand and Akashi's hand in his other as he hobbled over to the window. Bokto's hands were as cold as ice, causing Akashi's concern for him to grow even more. But no matter how much he worried for him, Akashi continued on the way to the window at a slow and steady pace until they finally made it. Once there, Bokto pulled his hand from Akashi's and leaned it against the windowsill. The air was bitter and cold, and hit Bokto like a slap to the face as another gust of wind forced its way into the hospital room. Did this not faze him, however, as Bokto only closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing the burst of winter air to fill his lungs. When he exhaled, a puff of smoke left him. Bokto stuck his head out of the window slightly and kept it there as the snowflakes fell all around him. Don't do that. Akashi pulled Bokto back inside. He expected to hear a whine of resistance from him, but instead received nothing. Bokto only complied and stuck his entire arm out instead, watching as each individual snowflake passed around his limb, as if no one wanted to touch him. On occasion, one or two would land on him, and he would draw his hand in quickly to try and see as if he could make out a small pattern on them. He would study them for quite a while until they melted and left nothing more behind than a droplet on his arm. After this, he would repeat the same process, paying little to no mind to the freezing cold that surrounded him. Akashi watched Bokuto, mesmerized by his actions. He almost portrayed the behaviors of a child, sticking to an activity and refusing to let it up, repeating whatever he was up to without having anyone to tell him to stop. Akashi furrowed his brow and looked outside, away from Bokuto. That familiar feeling of dread was rising up within him, and something Akashi wanted to forget. He placed one hand on the windowsill and squeezed, his knuckles going white. They shared another moment of silence, something that occurred more often than Akashi would have liked. Though Bokuto's speaking skills weren't as good as they used to be, he was still the more talkative one out of the group, so whenever he went silent, an unwelcome feeling of discomfort found its home within Akashi. He wanted to rid himself of this feeling, rid himself of this silence, so he reached in his mind in haste for any word that came to him. He needed something, anything, to say to Bokuto, just so that he could liberate himself of the horrid feeling that threatened to overtake him. You know, I never asked, Akashi managed to say, staring out into the distance. Why are you so fond of the snow, Bokuto? He waited for an answer, but did not receive one. Unnerved, he spoke again. I mean, in your state now, it's a bit cliché, don't you think? It was his attempt at brightening the mood, or being funny, as some called him. But alas, his word had fallen flat on the ground as he received another silent reply from Bokuto. Akashi frowned deeply. He turned his head to get a clear look at Bokuto's face, but instantly wished he hadn't. In this silence, Bokuto wept himself, fat tears rolling down his cheeks in numbers. The hand that supported his weight against the windowsill trembled without pause, and his other remained outside, shaking in the cold dead of the night. Several flakes had gathered on an outstretched limb, but they were not quick to melt. They settled there, deeming Bokuto one of them for the remainder of their frozen lives before they eventually fell or melted away. Akashi stared at Bokuto, opened his mouth to say something, but found that he couldn't form even one simple word. Realizing this, Akashi decided to take action instead and reach out to comfort him. But not even this he could do so. His arms and legs were stiff, as were his eyes. All he could do was stare at the melancholic performance that played out before him. Do something. Akashi closed his mouth and swallowed. Do something. Anything. Akashi's body didn't respond. He could only watch as those tears fell at a faster pace, down onto his hospital gowns and onto the floor. The light that came from outside reflected off of Bokuto's teardrops, lighting his face up in the most gentle of ways. Eventually, Bokuto drew his hand back and let it fall to his side. He hung his head and tried to keep his crying controlled in the best way possible. But this proved to be very difficult as sobs broke out of him, causing his entire being to shake. After a moment of trying to gather himself, Bokuto choked out two simple words with quivering lips. Why me? Akashi stared as his mind searched for words. He found some and said them without a single thought. Because life is unfair. Bokuto reached up a cold, frail hand to wipe at the mess that was his face. I wanted to do so many things. I know. Akashi balled his hands to the fist, mentally scolding himself for the present lack of emotion in his voice. As Bokuto backed away from the window, Akashi was quick to close it, locking the bitter night air out of the room for the remainder of the night. He then reached out and took hold of Bokuto's arm to help him back onto the bed. Once they reached it, Bokuto resumed his usual position and wrapped a thick blanket around himself, then turned away from Akashi. He watched the window quietly, paying no mind to his visitor, or so Akashi thought. In a matter of minutes, just as Akashi had started to fidget, Bokuto spoke up. Akashi? Yes? His undivided attention was on Bokuto. He hesitated for a moment, but finally spoke up. I don't want you to visit me anymore. Akashi's eyes squinted to the words, and he leaned forward in shock. What? Please don't visit me anymore. No. Akashi stood from his seat. Please, no. It's a little too late for that, Bokuto. A shiver racked Akashi, causing the hairs on his back of his neck to stand. Akashi, please. No is my final answer. He stalked over to the other side of the bed, where he would be able to look at Bokuto's face. Once Bokuto noticed this, he turned his head and slowly rolled away. Akashi's eyes widened, his emotion now falling victim to a strange mix of fear and fury. Bokuto, what's the meaning of this? Bokuto didn't respond. He remained in the same position and only moved his hand to wipe at his face again. Answer me. Sucking his teeth, Bokuto pulled the blanket up just beneath his chin. It took some time, but he finally answered. I don't want you to grow any more attached to me than you already are. Akashi nearly scoffed. What makes you think I'm attached to you? I never said that I was. This time, Bokuto directed his attention to Akashi. He wore a grimace upon his reddened face. Shut up, Akashi. He breathed in deeply, frustrated with himself and the gradual growth of his speech impediment, but continued on. I know you hate hospitals. Don't come telling me now that you have only been coming here every day because you wanted to. Akashi had nothing else to say. He stared at Bokuto with his lips parted as if he were going to speak, but ended up speechless. I know that you care, even if it's just a little bit. Bokuto covered his mouth and coughed suddenly. He found that speaking was taking up more energy than he thought. Still, he continued to talk. I don't know much about this disease, partly because I was too afraid to read upon on it, but now I don't have much time. His frustration slowly faded, and all that was left upon his pale face was a look of defeat. 1, maybe 2 months at most. If I'm lucky, that's how long I know I have left. The air around Akashi thickened, and suddenly he found it difficult to breathe. Bokuto looked down and twisted his lips to the side. I heard the doctors talking. They don't know how to heal me, so... From beneath the blanket, Akashi could see Bokuto's shoulder rise and fall. It's just a slow downhill ride from here, and I don't want you to see it all happen. Bokuto lay there glass-eyed, his well-up tears glinting in the dim lighting of the room. I don't want you to watch me decay. Small tears spilled out of Bokuto's eyes and rolled down his hauntingly placid features. So I figured if you left now, you wouldn't have to, and it wouldn't hurt so much. Once again, that crippling spell took hold of him, and Akashi couldn't move, nor could he speak. All he could do was watch in muted anguish as Bokuto finally accepted what had become his short-lived life. Akashi realized that those smiles he'd seen before were smiles of denial, forced grins that tried desperately to trick Bokuto into thinking that everything would be fine. But he couldn't keep it up forever, not in the state that he was in. Bokuto had always been struggling to keep up a positive front, but inside he was falling apart all along. Akashi knew this now. In an attempt to move, he tapped his fingers against his leg at an impatient pace. He was trying everything he could to psych himself into doing at least something to let Bokuto know that he was there for him. do something, as he were one of the living dead. Akashi forced one leg forward, then the next, until he was touching the bedside. He pushed his negative thought aside and sat himself down in bed, right next to Bokuto. Akashi did not give him time to react as he moved closer still, and when he was close enough, he lowered his head to lean in on Bokuto's shoulder. Akashi squeezed his hands together to keep them from shaking uncontrollably. "I'm not leaving, Kotaro." His voice was hushed, gentle. "And nothing you say will ever make me leave." Bokuto kept silence. Not a word left him, even as he reached a hand up to wipe at his face again. He only sniffed on occasion and shifted in pace, but never did he say anything to oppose Akashi's decision. He was glad. Akashi turned his head slightly. His cheek was gently resting on Bokuto's shoulder. He took in a slow, deep breath and closed his eyes, and his eyebrows knit together for only a second. His hands quivered as he dug his nails into his knuckles. Bokuto no longer smelled like a hospital. Bokuto smelled like home. The reflection of ending movie credits could be seen in Akashi's eyes as they scrolled up along the screen of his laptop. Sitting back, he reached a hand out and paused the movie that had been on screen. "So, how was it, watching the movie for 1,000th time?" There was almost a hint of sarcasm in his voice. Laying next to Akashi, a ghostly pale Bokuto smiled. "Good." Bokuto eased back and buried his head into his pillow. He looked in Akashi's direction. It took a moment for Bokuto to focus on him. Pulling his laptop close, Akashi smoothed his finger on the mouse pad. He looked to the lower right corner of the screen. January 19th. Akashi pulled a solemn face and closed the laptop. He moved in his seat and sat straight against the head of the bed, then looked down at Bokuto. His tired eyes were on Akashi. He was grinning. Forcing a smile of his own, Akashi tilted his head only slightly. "What are you smiling at?" He reached a hand out and touched Bokuto's forehead. He was cool to the touch, colder than most. Akashi was quick to withdraw his hand, but he managed it discreetly. It took a moment for Bokuto to respond, but after some time he managed some words. "Thank you." "Don't worry about it." A sheepish grin curled on Akashi's lips. "I know you're fond of that movie." He looked down at Bokuto as he said this and glanced away soon after. Something told him that those words weren't meant for the movie, but Akashi shoved this thought away. He twisted his body to reach the box of Pocky that sat on the counter. He opened it and pulled one out. "Do you want one?" Bokuto nodded and stretched a wobbling arm out. Akashi placed it between his fingers, and Bokuto retracted his hand to hold the biscuit snack against himself. He held it to his nose with some difficulty and breathed in the strawberry scent, then let his arms fall. He touched at it slightly, twirled it shakily between his fingers, and studied it, but he never ate it. Akashi placed the box back onto the counter and huffed softly. "You seem to have grown more attached to that Pocky stick than me." Bokuto looked up, surprised, and glanced back down at the snack of his hands. It took time for Akashi's words to reach him, but when they finally did, his face lit up as he broke out in laughter. It was the weakest sound Akashi had ever heard. "Ah, I finally said something funny." Akashi chuckled along with Bokuto, folding his arms in the process. "I told you I had my moments ever so often." Bokuto's laughter died down and he closed his eyes. Rarely. "Give me a break here." Akashi's chortling had been dragged out for a few seconds longer before he, too, quieted down. They remained speechless in each other's company for several minutes before Bokuto finally spoke up. His voice sounded like nothing more than a mere whisper. "Keiichi." Akashi looked at him. "Mm-hmm." Bokuto swallowed thickly and toyed with the Pocky in his hands. "Ask me why I like Cloud Atlas so much. Perplexed, Akashi directed his full attention to Bokuto. Well, alright, Kotaro, why do you like Cloud Atlas so much? He watched Bokuto intently, curious to know what his answer would be. Looking up at Akashi with eager eyes, as if he'd been asked the question out of his own free will, Bokuto gladly answered. So you know, in the movie when the characters die in one life? He kept his wary yellow eyes on Akashi, waiting for him to nod. Once he did, Bokuto continued. Well, I like it when they find each other again in another life. Bokuto's voice was soft, measly, and carried no force to it. But as he spoke about his favorite scene, Akashi could sense a powerful vibe coming from him, one that wasn't there before, a hopeful one. It makes me feel like I have another life, one beyond this one that's better, where I can actually wake up to you and be with you. A smile played on his pale, thin lips, one where we can live normal lives instead of living this one. Akashi couldn't find any words at that moment. He stared at Bokuto and could only nod with whatever it was he thought he was agreeing with. He felt as if all the air had been squeezed out of his body by the words that Bokuto had spoken. Of all the things that Bokuto found most endearing of the movie, Akashi never thought it would be that. Managing a miserable smile, Akashi roughly rubbed his palm with his thumb. You know, I would like that very much. He spoke gently in Bokuto's direction. Me too. Bokuto's eyes never left Akashi's. He stared at them intently and watched every move he made, to the point where this had captured Akashi's attention. Why do you watch me like that? His emerald eyes met golden ones. Though the question was asked clearly, Bokuto didn't make a sound, nor did he move. He instead continued to stare in Akashi's direction with hopeful eyes. After what felt like the longest 10 seconds of his life, a sudden shudder charged down Akashi's spine, causing goosebumps to rise on his flesh. He held his breath, then proceeded to ask again. Kotaro, why do you watch me like that? It took every fiber of his being to keep his voice from trembling. It was then that Bokuto's eyes blinked in realization. Slowly but surely, he moved his lips to answer. Just because. He replied in what almost sounded like a surprised tone. I didn't want you to leave. Sometimes when I blink, you aren't there anymore. Bokuto rubbed one of his eyes, then the other, and then let his hand drop to his sides. Akashi tried to hide his frown. His eyes looked down at Bokuto's hands. They were thin and bony, and he could see the smooth blue veins curling over the bones beneath his flesh. He reached a hand out and took Bokuto's hand in his own. Bokuto's automatic reaction to the warmth was to curl his fingers around Akashi's grasp. He looked at him and exhaled through his nose quietly. Akashi met his gaze, then looked down. Don't worry, I'm still here. Bokuto nodded feebly against his pillow. I'm still here too. His voice was weaker than before, if possible. Akashi nodded, with him. Yeah, you're here too. With what little strength he had left, Bokuto beamed. Akashi wished he could do the same. You have a new message from Kuro, sent January 31st at 2:25 p.m. Hey, are you there? Akashi. Yes, I am. Kuro. How are things? Akashi. Things could be better, things could be worse. Kuro. May I ask how Bokuto's doing? Akashi. He's hanging on. Kuro. Can he still walk or talk? Akashi. No, he can't. He lost the ability to walk a little more than a week ago. His ability to speak left him soon after. Kuro, I see. You really are straightforward, aren't you? Akashi, I don't know any other way to put it, sorry. Akashi looked up from his phone after sending the message and turned his head to notice that Bokuto was once again staring at him with acute interest. His eyes read, Who's that? Stuffing his phone in his pocket, Akashi shrugged. Just Kuro. He said the name with a lack of interest to try and soften the blow. But Akashi knew that no matter how he approached it, Bokuto would frown when he heard the name. And he did. Bokuto looked at Akashi's hand. His eyes gave away just how much he missed his friend. Feeling an amount of guilt build up within his chest, Akashi pulled out his phone just as quickly as he'd hid it away. Would you like for him to send a photo? Bokuto looked back and thought for a moment, then nodded. Playing off of this, Akashi texted Kuho to send an image of himself for Bokuto to see. It took quite some time for a message from Kuho to arrive, but when it did, Akashi realized that he sent a video instead of what he was initially asked for. Akashi leaned over in his seat to move himself closer to Bokuto. With one elbow on the bed, he held his phone so that the both of them could see. Bokuto stared at the screen with interested eyes, wondering what the content would consist of. Akashi pressed play, and the video of Kuho started to play. He sat at home in bed, with a snug-fitting shirt on and his hair an absolute mess. What's up, guys? I know you didn't tell me to send video, but I'm not someone who follows rules. He pulled a mock cool expression, but it was cut short as someone else spoke up. From the background of the video, a low voice could be heard. What? Did you just say that to yourself? Well, no. Wow, no. I'm taking a video. Kuro panned the phone to his side, and a blurred camera came into focus on screen. He sat cross-legged, with a shirt on that was 2 sizes too big, and a hat that looked like as if it had been placed on his head without his consent. His head was down and his fingers moved swiftly over the buttons on the game device that he held in his hands. At one point he reached a hand up to grab the beanie off his head, and he aimlessly chucked it to the ground with force. Say hi, Kenma. Wait, what? I didn't hear what you said. Kenma looked up and was greeted with a front-facing camera. He quickly got up from the bed and walked off. Don't record me. At least say hi, Kuro called. Hi. The disembodied voice came from off screen. And that's Kenma for you. Kuho groaned as he repositioned himself in bed, and then he smiled. But putting him aside, I hope all is well. He scratched at his cheek, just below his eye. I miss you guys. I miss you especially, Bokuto. Hang in there, alright? Akashi, don't give him a hard time, or you and I are going to fucking fight. Bokuto smiled wide to those words. He would have laughed if he could. A grin ghosted across Akashi's lips as well, but it was quick to vanish. Well, I guess that's it for now. I would have Kenma say bye too, but he turned his head to look around. He left the room? Yeah, he left the room. I'll just say bye for him. See you, Bokuto. Keep it cool. And remember, you're the best. He held his hand up in a peace sign, and the video ended with him on screen. Akashi sighed. He thought the video had gone by too quickly, but it had actually lasted a little under 30 seconds. For a guy whose name's Kuro, he sure is a colorful one. Akashi sat up and placed his phone on the counter. Bokuto nodded and looked up at Akashi once again. You guys were best friends, huh? Bokuto nodded once more. He struggled to raise a hand, and slowly he twirled his index finger in circles at the side of his bed. Akashi snored softly and leaned back in the seat. Is he crazy? The smile on Bokuto's lips grew just a little bit more, signifying that he answered yes to Akashi's question. It was moments like these that made Akashi realize just how much of an innocent soul Bokuto really was. Every now and then it would come to him that Bokuto was only 20 years old, and the fact would only weigh Akashi down even more than it usually did. It hurt him to think that Bokuto had barely even experienced the joys of a young adult's life before that crippling disease had taken a hold of him. It was frustrating. It was frustrating and infuriating. It was overall saddening. But Akashi could not show any of this, not in front of Bokuto. So instead of putting up on a sour expression, Akashi only kept a neutral one, like he always did. It was his best and only way to hide his pain. Several hours had passed since the message from Kuro, and both Bokuto and Akashi didn't do much. Without a voice, Bokuto couldn't keep up a conversation as well as he used to, no matter how hard he tried. And even if he could speak, he wouldn't have been able to talk for long considering the state he was in. His movements were uncoordinated and slow, and the only sounds he could manage were meek and most of the time inaudible. At times, Bokuto would do nothing more but lie there in bed, twitching back awake whenever his body tried so desperately to fall into a sleeping state that it once knew. When this would happen, he'd pull a frustrated expression for only a minute before his face grew too tired to hold it any longer. When Bokuto was like this, Akashi would normally look away to spare himself the sight of it all. But on rare occasions, there were times where he had no choice but to watch Bokuto fall apart at the hands of his illness, and he hated it. For every time Akashi would witness this, his mind would repeat one phrase, whether he wanted to hear it or not. This is what a dying person looks like. Looking down swiftly, Akashi's sight locked onto his hands. He glared at them intensely with that same placid expression of his, making this look all the more unnerving. He wanted the thought to leave his mind. He wanted nothing to do with it. He forced those words away and replaced them with new ones that said, "He's not dying. He's going to be fine." But as he thought of it, as he narrowed down the true meanings of both phrases, he ultimately could not decide which one of the two were more horrifying. Akashi closed his eyes and heaved out a sigh, feeling more and more hopeless with each passing second. He feared he wouldn't be able to pull himself out of this state, but then it occurred to him that he was not alone in this. He felt the gentlest of taps against his arm, and turned his head to meet eyes that were as concerned as they were exhausted. Akashi sat up straight and composed himself. "I'm fine," he commented softly, leaning back into his seat. "How are you feeling, Taro?" Bokuto blinked slowly. This was his way of saying he was feeling all right. Not great, but all right. Akashi pursed his lips and nodded once. He found himself unable to say anything else, figuring that Bokuto wouldn't have to say either, but he was wrong. Again, he felt the light tapping against his arm. Surprised, Akashi gave Bokuto his attention again. What is it?" He turned the chair so that he was now facing Bokuto from the front. Gazing up at Akashi, Bokuto frowned and tried to form some words, but failed in the end. He looked around and moved his fingers, trying to make out a phone. Akashi picked up this quickly, and he pulled out this phone for Bokuto to use. He opened his note application and held the device in front of Bokuto. It was then that he had started to inaccurately press the words that he was trying to make out. It took him some time to get down what he wanted to say, but after several minutes he withdrew his hand. Akashi looked at his phone to read the sentence. It read, "If I knew those words I spoke a week ago would have been my last, I would have chosen them more carefully." Akashi stared intensely at the screen, then tore his gaze away and looked back at Bokuto. "You weren't happy with those words?" Slowly, Bokuto nodded. "Well, then, if you had a second chance..." Akashi hesitated. He almost didn't want to ask the question. What would you have chosen to say? Just as those words left Akashi's mouth, the clouds outside parted, allowing the setting sun's orange light to flood the room. It illuminated both Bokuto and Akashi, and he squinted at the same time. Despite this, Akashi did not miss the look of slight nervousness that claimed Bokuto's features. He was now more curious than he'd ever been before. Bokuto, you don't have to say it now if you don't want to. Bokuto shook his head. So, you don't want to? He shook his head again, stronger this time. You do want to say it now. This time, a weak sound left Bokuto's throat through a closed mouth, and he nodded. All right. Akashi shifted his seat, now timid. He glanced to the side. How many words are there in what you want to say? I mean, responding as slowly as ever, Bokuto raised one hand, and on that one hand, 3 fingers stuck out. Akashi felt his hand stick to his stomach. Another shudder threatened to rattle him, but he kept himself still, as difficult as that was. 3 words? That's all? Akashi forced a smile. They felt mandatory. That's interesting. Please don't say them. He reached his arm out and held his phone in front of Bokuto for him to type. Please don't type them. I don't want to hear them. I don't want to read them. I don't want to know them. For what felt like an eternity, Bokuto typed the words on Akashi's phone. His hands wobbled so much that it was impossible to decipher which letters he was hitting. Akashi was close to holding his breath before Bokuto had finally drew his hand back. He let it fall over his stomach, and there it rested. His golden eyes searched the room for Akashi. When he finally found him, those shining eyes of his lit up just a little more than usual, and with that glint came a smile. It was small and measly, but there. Akashi made sure to take a mental picture of this before he looked down and closed his eyes. He gripped his phone in his hands and took in a deep breath, filling his lungs with all the air that he could before he exhaled through his nostrils. He turned his phone so that it was facing him, opened his eyes, and read the 3 words that would haunt him forever. Or so he thought. Akashi's eyes wilded slightly, and his eyebrows knit together in surprise. What sat upon the screen was not what he thought it would be, but rather a simple compliment. You are beautiful. Freezing in his seat, Akashi read the words 10 times over before he finally looked up. He could feel his heartbeat thumping hard against his chest, as if it wanted to break free. His eyes locked onto Bokuto's. You think that I'm beautiful? He asked in this tone of disbelief. Mustering a weak nod, Bokuto's lips curled at the sides just a bit more. With this, he raised a quivering hand and his index finger. He was trying to tell Akashi something else. Guessing quickly, Akashi muttered, 1. Bokuto kept his finger up, then moved his hand to point at itself. He did not give Akashi time to voice his guess, as he then moved his finger to point at his eye, then finally at Akashi. Weakly, Akashi parted his lips. He almost couldn't find his voice, but when he did, he tried his best to keep it from shaking. Since the day you saw me. To this, Bokuto's arm fell and rested slightly on his stomach. He did the only thing that he could and nodded again, then closed his eyes and slightly turned his head away. Akashi walked curiously as Bokuto's lips quivered into a wide grin, and as the light captured his features, Akashi realized just how embarrassed Bokuto actually was. His face glowed the quiet shades of red, and he tried to hide it from Akashi. It seemed that, after finally hearing his pent-up thoughts aloud, they had frayed his nerves more than they thought they would. Seeing this display unfold before him, Akashi could barely think. His heart beat a mile a minute, he found it difficult to swallow, and one of his legs bounced up and down rapidly. He didn't know how to react, didn't know what to do or say, but as he searched for the right words to speak or the right thing to do, Akashi found himself doing something he didn't expect of himself. A light-hearted laugh bubbled out from deep within his chest, and the sound filled the room as soon as it hit the air. He laughed hard, or at least hard as he could. His voice was gentle, light on Bokuto's ears. It caused him to open his eyes and look in Akashi's direction, astonished. Those honey-hued eyes took in all that they could of Akashi's laughing face, the way his lips curled at the corners, the way his eyes squinted just enough so that only a glint of green could be seen. Bokuto captured it all, and in no time he found himself laughing too. It was a quiet laugh. It was so weak and feeble. It could barely be heard, but it was there, and Akashi could hear it, so that was enough for Bokuto. His face still wore the same shade of red, but he no longer minded this. He was happy where he was. He was happy that he'd admitted those words. He was glad that Akashi found company in him. Finally, a breath between his laughter, Akashi managed to speak. "You're ridiculous," he said lightheartedly, his fingers trembling around his phone. Bokuto gave him a look that could only be read as, "I am, aren't I?" Slowly, Akashi's laughter eased to a chuckle, and as he sat there in his seat, he looked down at Bokuto with placid eyes. A genuine expression made its home on Akashi's features, and a hand reached up to push through his raven locks. "Thank you, Kotaro," he whispered softly, his voice shaking in his throat. He reached a hand out and found Bokuto's. Bokuto tightened his grasp in an automatic way he always did. He stared up at Akashi with a smile that never seemed to fade. His eyes read, "You're welcome, Keiji." February 2nd. What time is it? Akashi stirred in bed slightly and let out a weak grunt. He didn't bother to check. He didn't care. The sky was already black. He figured it was already past 5 in the afternoon, so he didn't care anymore. He didn't care if it was 7 at night, or 8 at night, or 12 in the morning, or if the world's clock stopped moving altogether. All he cared about was the fact that Bokuto was still with him, next to him, breathing, alive. All he cared about was the fact that Bokuto Kotaro was still there. Akashi moved his head to the side and touched his forehead to Bokuto's neck. Bokuto's movements were late to this, but he reacted nonetheless as he turned Akashi's way to touch his chin on top of his head. The soft touch of Akashi's hair against his chin comforted Bokuto and pulled him into a relaxed state. Akashi liked it when this happened. It would cause less spasms to grip Bokuto's body, allowing him to unwind more than he usually could. Akashi didn't know why he had this effect on him, but he did, and that was all that mattered to him. But the day was exceptionally cold. Akashi was glad to know that the hospital's room provided enough heat to keep Bokuto from freezing over. But even so, Bokuto still suffered from trembling spells, and they would come in small, short bursts and last only several seconds before his body became too weak to keep it up. Akashi always made sure to hold Bokuto close and squeeze him tight whenever this happened, just to let him know that he was there for him, that he wasn't another one of those illusions that his mind could create. Akashi would also murmur quiet things to him from time to keep up a small, often one-sided conversation. He usually asked yes or no questions, ones that were easy for Bokuto to answer with a nod or a shake of the head, but sometimes he wouldn't answer certain questions, despite Akashi asking them twice. He wouldn't always get answers. Akashi was aware of this, but he would still ask them things. At other times, he would just tell them things that were on his mind. It was strange how the less Bokuto asked, the more Akashi found himself saying. Relaxing his head against the crook of Bokuto's neck, Akashi blinked warily and stared off into the distance. He focused on nothing. Something he remembered Kenma doing. His hand held onto one of Bokuto's very thin arms, and his thumb would occasionally rub up and down to comfort him. They shared the same navy blue knit blanket and huddled up beneath it, keeping each other warm in the best way that they could. As Akashi lay there, quiet, listening to Bokuto's strained breathing, he opened his mouth to ask, "Kotaro?" He spoke just loudly enough for Bokuto to hear him. He felt him move against his head in response, so he continued. He drew in a deep breath and blinked away the sting in his eyes. "I want you to know that I don't regret meeting you." Bokuto didn't move much. He just breathed now. "I am very happy to have met you and have gotten to know you." Akashi paused for a long moment and said nothing for a while, but then he spoke up again. "So, thank you, Kotaro, for talking to me in the hall that day and asking me if I was alright, because I wasn't then, but I am now." Slipping his hand down to Bokuto's chest, Akashi leaned against his frail frame. As Akashi listened to the quickened rate of Bokuto's still beating heart and knew that this was the response to his words. Akashi closed his eyes against him. He found he had nothing more to say. He instead allowed his actions to speak for him. He pulled himself closer to Bokuto and nudged his face into the warmth of his neck. He could feel Bokuto's chin rubbing against the top of his head, like it always did, but it never failed to comfort Akashi. He breathed in a familiar scent that he'd grown so attached to, then exhaled quietly against Bokuto's prominent collarbone. Akashi could feel a weak, ailing arm pull itself up to rest upon its shoulder. To this, he shifted in closer and allowed his body to relax. His breathing evened out, and in no time, he could feel himself slipping, slowly, into the warm grasp of sleep, unable to resist. In a daze, Akashi's last words were, "Good night, Kotaro," before he slipped off into a deep sleep. He dreamt of nothing in particular that night. He suffered no nightmares, nor did he see anything remotely close to a dream. There was nothing. There was only blackness. Akashi woke up to the feeling of sunlight against his face. It was warm on him, certainly something that one would find comforting. But as he stirred in bed, he was certain that something was off. He kept his eyes half-lidded and his movements reserved, clinging onto the false hope that Bokuto wasn't moving because he didn't want to wake him. But Akashi knew that this wasn't the case. He just didn't want to accept it. Stretching out a trembling arm, Akashi took hold of Bokuto's hand. He shut his eyes and squeezed his palm. It was cold. His hands trembled harder with each passing second, as if the movement would cause Bokuto to wake up. Akashi's face buried into the crook of his neck. He nudged the bridge of his nose against the cool skin. His lips brushed against his collarbone in desperate search of that familiar warmth. Both hands had clasped around Bokuto's own now, quavering without pause. He couldn't find his pulse. Devastation weighed down on Akashi in that instant. It was a surreal feeling, one that he would never in 1,000,000 years describe. It squeezed him, threatening to crush him from the inside out. The pain seared itself into his soul, hindering him, rendering him speechless to a point where he no longer knew what words were. A sob wrenched his way out from Akashi's throat. He tried desperately to hold it in, tried so hard to keep himself together, but he knew he was too weak to pose such a bluff. Once the second sob had left him, he felt himself spiraling. There was no hiding it. He was undone. His body jerked with each sob that was torn from him, his frame curling to bring himself closer. He held his face against the corpse's neck, just beneath the jawline, breathing in all that was left from Bokuto. He had so many things he wanted to do with him, so many things he wanted to say, but all of those things seemed to have fallen away once the moment had finally come. Akashi wanted to scream, but he couldn't find his voice. Not even a sentence could get past his suffering. He kept himself against Bokuto and held on to him with what little strength he had left in him. He didn't get up to alert the nurses or the doctors or anyone in the hospital. He knew that once they found out, they would take Bokuto away from him. So he stayed in place, holding on to Bokuto, taking his company for one last time before he'd never see him again. Once Akashi had left the hospital, he never looked back. He walked home that day with a balled-up blanket in his arms, a burgundy scarf around his neck, and nothing more from the hospital. He held them against his frame in 20-degree weather, and though many people gave him strange looks and watched him sideways, none of this affected him in the slightest. The cold was no longer a factor to Akashi. He couldn't feel it. His mind wouldn't allow him to. He made it home without so much as a hello to his parents, who sat in the living room. They asked him questions. He answered bluntly. They asked about the blanket and the scarf, but they never asked about Bokuto. Akashi was glad. It was a good idea to never have told him after all. He ascended the steps to his room, balled Bokuto's blanket up in a lump, and dropped it onto his bed along with the scarf. He reached into his pocket to fish out his phone and pushed call on one of his contacts. He held it up to his ear and waited for the other line to pick up. Once he did, Akashi was greeted with a "Hello?" Akashi hesitated. He swallowed thickly and looked out the window. "Hello. Kuro? It's Akashi. Are you busy?" Kuro's voice was reserved and reluctant. "No, I'm not. If it isn't too much trouble, may I come over?" Kuro was quiet on the other end. He already knew. He inhaled audibly, and Akashi could hear a scratching sound. After a moment, he finally spoke. His voice was solemn. "Sure." Akashi sat at the edge of Kuro's bed, and he stared out the window without focus. Kuro spoke to him, and Akashi listened and often responded, but most of the time he only sat there and continued to watch nothing. Kuro would have been concerned if not for finding out what had been happening earlier that day. He was much like Akashi, sitting on the same side of the bed, a good distance apart from his sitter. Those yellow eyes of his would often dart to the floor, then to the ceiling, around the room, and back to the floor, but he would never look at Akashi. He feared that if he did, he wouldn't be able to keep his emotions at bay. "How did he look?" Kuro asked with a hushed tone. It took Akashi a while to respond. "When I woke up? Yeah." Kuro looked down. Akashi let out a half-assed grunt and continued to stare forward. "Pale, sick, dead." "How did you find out that he wasn't there anymore?" His entire body was relaxed, his head rested on mine with the weight of someone who's unconscious. This time, Kuro was the one to grunt, the sound coming from deep within his chest. He was slow to speak up again, but did either way. "Are you going to his funeral?" "No." The answer came out so much more quickly than Kuro thought it would. It shocked him as Akashi continued. "I refuse to go. My last memory of Bokuto will not be of him sharply dressed, pale, stiff, and stuffed into a casket, surrounded by countless amount of people who did not care for him at all until the day they heard about his death. My last memory of Kotaro is already with me, and it will die along with me." Akashi's tone was monotonous, but Kuro didn't fail to detect the venom that lined with each word prior to his last sentence. He understood where Akashi was coming from and didn't even think of holding his icy tone against him. Kuro was just as bitter. He, too, did not intend on showing up to any funeral. He'd be furious with everyone in there, and he knew that the same pain burned within Akashi, too. Kuro leaned forward and joined his hands together. He stared at the wall and bounced one leg up and down as his emotions slowly started to reclaim him. He looked down and rubbed his neck roughly, leaving behind deep red marks. "Bokuto, he really cared about you. He talked about you all the time when he first met you." "Don't." Kuro froze. With his hands clinging to his neck, he slowly looked up to find that Akashi was staring back at him with vacant eyes, void of all known emotion. "Don't, Kuro, just don't." He swallowed thickly and turned his head to stare out the window again. Akashi laced his fingers together and dug his nails into the back of his hands. He was redirecting the pain. "Sorry." It was the last word Kuro murmured before he stared forward as well, having nothing more to say. They shared each other's company in silence for what felt like the length of 5 minutes, and in that time, Akashi never once looked to the side to catch a glimpse at Kuro. It wasn't until he watched Kuro's form double over in his perspective that Akashi did glance in his direction, and when he did, he was greeted with a quietly sobbing Kuro, his face having been buried into the palm of his hands. Though it was delayed, Akashi moved on instinct and sat near Kuro. He placed a hand on his broad back and rubbed gently, hoping to comfort him and to be stronger of the two. But as each second passed, Akashi could feel his own pain building up more and more within him. He wished he could fight it, but he knew there was no possible way for him to. It wasn't long before Akashi had leaned his head on Kuro's shoulder, as he too fell victim to the sorrow that slowly ate him alive. It had been 3 days since Bokuto's passing, and surely enough, sleep did not come to Akashi as easily as it used to. In the span of those 3 days, he had only acquired a little over 4 hours of sleep in total. On the first night out of the 3, Akashi flat out refused to get any rest in fear of suffering another night terror. But during the other 2 nights, he surely did make the effort to try and lull himself to sleep. But each time he did, he either found himself stirring awake from a strange dream or lying awake in the middle of the night, half expecting to receive a message from Bokuto. At times, Akashi would look through the conversations that he'd shared with him. He'd scroll up until the first text, then would scroll all the way down again, waiting for the ellipse to appear on the lower side of the screen. But always he'd receive nothing. That night was no different, as Akashi repeated this action for the 20th time that day, his thumb scrolling up and down for minutes on end until he finally came to a stop. When he had, however, instead of shutting his phone off and trying to force a few hours of sleep on himself, Akashi stared at the phone screen longingly and read the last messages that were sent between him. Bokuto, sent at 12:15 a.m., December 20th. Hey, Akashi, are you awake? Akashi. Yes, I am. What is it? Bokuto. I'm excited for you to come over tomorrow. Akashi. I visit you every day, though. Bokuto. I know, but you never miss a day, and, don't your parents ever ask why you come here so much? Akashi. They think I'm interning, so they don't mind. Bokuto. Oh, works for me. Akashi. I would hope so. It works for me as well. I'll be sure to bring my laptop when I visit. We can watch Cloud Atlas again. Bokuto. Yes, please. Thank you, Akashi. December 20th at 3:45 p.m. You probably fell asleep. Sorry for always messaging you so late. Sleep well, Akashi. See you soon. Akashi frowned and felt this familiar pain in his chest. He reread, Sleep well, Akashi, and inhaled with frailty. Trying. He couldn't bring himself to read over the last 4 words of the text again and ultimately shut off his phone. He placed it on the counter near his bedside and buried himself into the blanket that he had so openly shared with Bokuto. Akashi inhaled deeply and closed his eyes, his eyebrows knitting together as his brow creased. It still smelled like him. Akashi relaxed himself against his mattress and closed his eyes, a powerless yawn leaving him. His head eased into his pillow, and to his surprise, within a matter of minutes, he could feel himself slipping. It felt strange, not falling asleep against Bokuto's body, but Akashi knew that he would have to get used to this form of sleeping by his lonesome once again. He just hoped that the night wouldn't bring him any malevolent dreams. All he wanted was to see Bokuto again, even for just a second. An exhausted breath left him, and Akashi finally fell asleep. That night, he dreamt of the first night Bokuto had come over to his home. He dreamt of how Bokuto had buried himself into the navy blue blanket next to watch the movie that played on the laptop screen, and how he held Bokuto in his arms at night to aid him in his attempt to sleep. He could still remember the small details, like how Bokuto's starry shirt would slip off his shoulder every so often when he stirred in bed, and how the feel of Bokuto's weight on him would take his breath away. Akashi could still feel the sensation of his wild white and black hair brushing against his cheek whenever he moved, and the warmth that came from it as he held him close. It was all still there, but there was something different about it all that puzzled Akashi. At one point in his dream, Akashi looked out the window. The night sky had suddenly become a pale blue, and the warm orange glow of the sun slowly spread across the horizon. He turned his head slowly to look at Bokuto and watched him as he lay in his arms. Akashi said his name, and to this Bokuto stirred awake. He turned his head and met Akashi's gaze with wary, well-rested eyes. He stretched and stifled a yawn, pushed his hand through the mess that was his hair, and relaxed his head against Akashi's shoulder. Sunlight broke into the room, cascading all along the walls and floor, and casting shadows all around. It lit Bokuto's face up just enough for Akashi to take those healthy features that were staring back at him. He felt his heart rate accelerate, and his throat tighten as his vision blurred. Bokuto beamed at him with a smile that spoke 1,000 words, and his hand reached out to touch Akashi's cheek. Akashi felt his palm, warm, full, caressing the round of his face. He leaned into his touch, and his vision began to fade, his eyes filling with tears. Bokuto leaned in and touched his forehead to Akashi. He was only a blurred shape now, but Akashi knew he was still there. Bokuto spoke, his voice peaceful, healthy, whole. "I found you." A trembling, tender laugh escaped Akashi. He smiled. "You found me." That was a long ride. I hope you guys are semi-okay. Hope you haven't puked like I did. And pause this video for a second to go and drink some water. I know you're crying your eyes out right now. Go drink some water, go eat some snacks, maybe Pocky. It took me quite some attempts to get through this without crying, but I think this is an achievement. Well, that's it. If you want, you can leave some fic recommendations down in the comments, and I'll see you guys next video. Bye!